Along the Jersey Shore, read for LibriVox.org by Alan Davis Drake. Boardwalk for Long Branch. Many improvements promised or already underway. Special to the New York Times. Long Branch, New Jersey, July 9. Not in many years has there been such interest taken in the welfare of this place as at the present time. Since it has received its new charter and is now termed a city, everyone residing here, from the summer cottagers to the all-year-round residents, is talking improvements, many of which are already under way. At a citizens' mass meeting a few nights ago, when nearly every cottager interested in Long Branch was in attendance, it was decided to widen the famous Ocean Avenue Drive to 75 or 100 feet. Erect a boardwalk along the ocean front, and build one or more casinos. P. Sanford Ross of Jersey City, who is president of the Long Branch Property Holders Association, which is composed principally of New Yorkers who own summer homes at Long Branch, said that he favored an ocean boulevard as perfect as possible. Other cottagers who are present expressed themselves in a like manner. The old George Lorillard stock farm at Eatontown, famous in the days of the Monmouth Park racecourse, and which, since the abandonment of racing in New Jersey, has been more or less neglected, has been sold by Frank Durand, representing the heirs who are selling the Lorillard estate. George Lorillard, as will be remembered, married a beautiful Southern woman, whom he met in Florida. After his death, Mrs. Lorillard became the Countess de Agreda through a marriage with an Italian nobleman. She died a few years ago, leaving 2 daughters, who now reside in Florence, Italy. They are sole heirs to Mr. Lorillard's vast estate, and are now converting portions of his real estate into money. The Lorillard farm at Eatontown cost Mr. Lorillard something like $40,000 before it was improved. It was sold to Edward P. Hatch of the firm of Lord and Taylor of New York for $14,000. It is understood that Mr. Hatch will use the farm for stock breeding purposes. Mrs. Philip Daly, who owns the Pennsylvania Clubhouse at West End, which did not open its doors last season, has finally decided to utilize the building for restaurant purposes. The Rumson Polo Club will hold a big tournament on July 25th. Some of the crack teams, including the Westchesters and Squadron A, will line up against the Rumsons. Harvey E. Fisk, the New York banker, who has been a summer resident at Elberon for several seasons past, expects to have a handsome country seat built here next fall. Mr. Fisk and family are occupying the Cherry Wild Cottage on Park Avenue, Elberon at present. The summer colonists from New York, who are familiar with the performances of the Metropolitan Opera Company during the winter months in New York, are delighted to know that Frank Rigo will put on some plays at the West End Casino. He has opened the summer season with The Bohemian Girl, and is well pleased with the patronage he is receiving from the cottagers and hotel guests. End of Along the Jersey Shore, July 10th, 1904. This recording is in the public domain.
April, North Carolina, by Harriet Monroe. Recorded for LibriVox.org by Laurie Ann Walden, North Carolina. Would you not be in Tryon now that the spring is here, when mockingbirds are praising the fresh, the blossomy year? Look, on the leafy carpet woven of winter's browns, iris and pink azaleas flutter their gaudy gowns. The dogwood spreads white meshes, so white and light and high, to catch the drifting sunlight out of the cobalt sky. The pointed beech and maple, the pines dark tufted, tall, pattern with many colors the mountain's purple wall. Hark, what a rushing torrent of crystal song falls sheer! Would you not be in Tryon now that the spring is here? End of poem. This recording is in the public domain.
The Black Country, being an excerpt from Rides on Railways by Samuel Sidney. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Recording by Andy Minter. Preface. The following pages are an attempt to supply something amusing, instructive and suggestive to travellers who, not caring particularly where they go or how long they stay at any particular place, may wish to know something of the towns and districts through which they pass, on their way to Wales, the Lakes of Cumberland, or the Highlands of Scotland, or to those who, having a brief vacation, may wish to employ it among pleasant rural scenes, and investigating the manufactures, the mines, and other sources of the commerce and influence of this small island and great country. In performing this task, I have relied partly on personal observation, partly on notes and the memory of former journeys, and, where needful, have used the historical information to be found in cyclopedias and local guidebooks. This must account for, if it does not excuse, the unequal space devoted to districts with equal claims to attention, but it would take years, if not a lifetime, to render the manuscript of so discursive a work complete and correct. I feel that I have been guilty of many faults of commission and omission, but if the friends of those localities to which I have not done justice will take the trouble to forward to me any facts or figures of public general interest, they shall be carefully embodied in any future edition, should the book, as I hope it will, arrive at such an honour and profit. S.S. London, August 1851. The Black Country. Walsall, Dudley, Wednesbury, Darlaston. The first diverging railway, after leaving Birmingham on the road to the north, is what, for want of a better name, is called the South Staffordshire, which connects Birmingham with Dudley, Walsall, Lichfield, and Tamworth, thus uniting the most purely agricultural with the most thoroughly manufacturing districts, and especially with that part of the great coalfield which is locally known as the Black Country. In this Black Country, including West Bromwich, Wednesbury, Dudley and Darlaston, Bilston, Wolverhampton, and several minor villages, a perpetual twilight reigns during the day, and during the night fires on all sides light up the dark landscape with a fiery glow. The pleasant green of pastures is almost unknown. The streams, in which no fishes swim, are black and unwholesome. The natural dead flat is often broken by huge hills of cinders and spoil from the mines. The few trees are stunted and blasted, no birds are to be seen except a few smoky sparrows, and for miles on miles a black waste spreads around, where furnaces continually smoke, steam engines thud and hiss, and long chains clank, while blind gin horses walk their doleful round. From time to time you pass a cluster of deserted, roofless cottages of dingiest brick, half swallowed up in sinking pits or inclined to every point of the compass, while the timbers point up like the ribs of a half-decayed corpse. The majority of the natives of this Tartarian region are in full keeping with the scenery, savages without the grace of savages, coarsely clad in filthy garments, with no change on weekdays and Sundays. They converse in a language belarded with fearful and disgusting oaths, which can scarcely be recognized as the same as that of civilized England. On working days few men are to be seen, they are in the pits or the ironworks, but women are met on the high road, clad in men's once white linsey-woolsey coats and felt hats, driving and cursing strings of donkeys laden with coals or iron rods for the use of the nailers. On certain rare holidays these people wash their faces, clothe themselves in decent garments, and, since the opening of the South Staffordshire Railway, take advantage of cheap excursion trains, go down to Birmingham to amuse themselves and make purchases. It would be a useful lesson for any one who is particularly well satisfied with the moral, educational, and religious state of his countrymen, to make a little journey through this Black Country. He will find that the amiable enthusiasts who meet every May at Exeter Hall to consider on the best means of converting certain aboriginal tribes in Africa, India, and the islands of the Pacific, need not go so far to find human beings more barbarous and yet more easily reclaimed. The people of this district are engaged in coal mining, in ironworks, in making nails and many other articles or parts of articles for the Birmingham trade. Their wages are, for the most part, good. Fuel is cheap. Well-supplied markets and means of obtaining the best clothing are close at hand. But within 60 years, a vast, dense population has been collected together in districts which were but thinly inhabited as long as the value lay on the surface, instead of in the bowels of the earth. The people gathered together, and found neither churches, nor schools, nor laws, nor customs, nor means for cleanliness at first, nor even an effective police to keep order, and thus they became one of the most ignorant, brutal, depraved, drunken, unhealthy populations in the kingdom, unless it be a set of people in the same occupations in the neighbourhood of Manchester. We shall never forget, some 25 years ago, passing near Bilston on a summer's holiday, and seeing a great red-pied bull, foaming and roaring, and marching round a ring in which he was chained, while a crowd of men, each with a demoniacal-looking bulldog in his arms, and a number of ragged women with their hair about their ears, some of them also carrying bulldog pups, yelled about the baited bull. It gave us an awful fright, and haunted our childish dreams for years after. The first change forced upon the governing classes by feelings of self-protection was an organised police, and the black people are now more disgusting than dangerous. The cholera of 1832, which decimated Bilston and Wednesbury, did something towards calling attention to the grievous social and sanitary wants of this district. In that pestilence several clergymen and medical men died like heroes in the discharge of their duties. Some churches were built, some schools established, but an immense work remains to be done. Bull-baiting has been put down, but no rational amusements have been substituted for that brutal and exciting sport. In the northern coalfields, near Newcastle upon Tyne especially, we have noticed that when the miner ascends from the pit in the evening, his first care is to wash himself from head to foot, then to put on a clean suit of white flannel. As you pass along the one street of a pitman's village, you will see the father reading a Chambers Journal or a cheap religious magazine at the door of his cottage, while smoking a pipe and nursing a child or two on his knee, and through the open door a neat four-post bed and an oak or mahogany chest of drawers bear witness to his frugality. In Wednesbury, Bilston, and all that district, when work is over, you find the men drinking in their dirty clothes and with grimy faces at the beer shop of the butty, that is to say, the contractor or middleman under whom they work, according to the system of the country, and the women hanging about the doors of their dingy dwellings, gossiping or quarrelling, the old furies and the young slatterns. In the face of such savagery, so evidently the result of defective education, two opposite and extreme parties in the state, the anti-church Miles and the pro-church Anthony Denisons, combine to oppose the multiplication of education that teaches decency if it teaches nothing else. One great step has been made by the Health of Towns Act, which is about to be applied to some of these coal towns, and railways have rendered the whole district so accessible that no foul spot can long remain unknown or unnoticed. Walsall, 8 miles from Birmingham, the first town on our way, which may be reached directly by following the South Staffordshire, or by an omnibus travelling half a mile from Bescot Bridge, lies among green fields, out of the bounds of the mining country, although upon the edge of the Warwickshire and Staffordshire coalfield. Indeed, the parliamentary borough includes part of the rough population just described. It is very clean, without antiquities or picturesque beauties, and contains nothing to attract visitors except its manufactures, of which the best known is cheap saddlery for the American, West Indian, and Australian markets. They make the leather and wooden parts as well as stirrups and bridles. Also, gunlocks, bits, spurs, spades, hinges, screws, files, edge tools, and there is one steel pen manufactory, besides many articles connected with the Birmingham trade, either finished or unfinished, the number of which is constantly increasing. Walsall is celebrated for its pig market, a celebrity which railroads have not destroyed, as was expected, but rather increased. Special arrangements for comfortably disembarking these, the most interesting strangers who visit Walsall, have been made at the railway station. The principal church, with a handsome spire, stands upon a hill, and forms a landmark for the surrounding country. The ascent to it by a number of steps has, according to popular prejudice, produced an effect upon the legs of the inhabitants more strengthening than elegant, which has originated the provincial phrase of Walsall-legged, but this is no doubt a libel on the understandings of the independent borough. The houses are chiefly built of brick, but it seems as if some years ago the inhabitants had been seized with an architectural disease, which has left its marks in the shape of an eruption of stucco porticos and one or two pretentious mansions, externally resembling jails or infirmaries, internally boasting halls which bear the same proportion to the living rooms as Falstaff's gallon of sack to his halfpennyworth of bread. No doubt there are persons whom this style of house exactly suits. The portico represents their pride, the parlour their economy. What was intended for the Walsall Public Library consists of a thin closet behind a gigantic Ionic portico, now tottering to its fall, and in like manner a perfectly dungeon-like effect has been given to the principal hotel by another portico, which affords a much better idea of the charges than of the accommodation to be found within. As a general rule in travelling, we pass by all hotels with porticos, to take refuge in more modest green dragons or blue boars. Walsall has a municipal corporation of 6 aldermen and 18 councillors. The Reform Bill, to increase the troubles of this innocent borough, placed it in Schedule B, and gave it the privilege of making 1 member of Parliament. Fierce contests at every general election have been the result, in which some blood, much money, and more beer have been expended. But neither party has thought it worth while to make the education of the savages of the Black Country a piece of politics, and if anyone did, he would only be torn to pieces between Church and Dissenters. Dudley, in Worcestershire, about 6 miles from Walsall by the South Staffordshire Railway, has a castle, and more than one legend for the antiquarian, a cave and limestone pits full of fossils for the geologist, and especial interest for the historical economist, being the centre of the district where the first successful attempts were made to smelt iron by coal, a process which has contributed almost as much as our success in textile manufactures to give this small island a wealth and power which a merely agricultural, non-exporting community could never have attained. Iron was manufactured with charcoal in England from the time of the Romans till the middle of the 18th century, when the timber of many counties had been entirely exhausted by the process. In 1558, in the reign of Elizabeth, it was enacted that no timber of the breadth of 1 foot square at the stub, and growing within 14 miles of the sea, or any part of the river Thames or Severn, or any other river, creek, or stream, by the which carriage is commonly used by boat or other vessel to any part of the sea, shall be converted to coal or fuel for making iron. And in 1581 a further act was passed to prevent the destruction of timber, for remedy whereof it was enacted that no new ironworks should be erected within 22 miles of London, nor within 14 miles of the river Thames, nor in the several parts of Sussex near the sea therein named. This act not to extend to the woods of Christopher Durrell in the parish of Newdigate, within the Weald of Surrey, which woods have been coppiced by him for the use of his ironworks in those parts. At the same period we find from a letter in the Stradling correspondence, that while iron was made in Surrey, Sussex, and Kent, where not a pound is now manufactured, in Glamorganshire, at present a great seat of iron manufacture, iron was so scarce that an anvil was leased out at the rent of 3 shillings and 4pence a year, a rent at which, taking the then value of money, a very tolerable anvil could now be purchased. When the woods of the kingdom began to be exhausted, attention was turned to pit coal, which had long been in use for fuel in the counties where it was plentifully found. A curious account of the first successful experiments is to be found, told in very quaint language, in the Metallum Martis of Dudley Dudley, son of Lord Edward Dudley, an ancestor of the late Earl Dudley and Ward, and of the present Lord Ward, who now enjoys the very estates referred to, and derives a princely income from the mineral treasures, the true value of which was discovered by his unfortunate ancestor, published in the reign of Charles II. This Mr. Dudley was an early victim of the patent laws, which to this day have proved to be for the benefit of lawyers and officials, and the tantalization of true inventors and discoverers. The following extracts contain his story, and enable us to compare the present with the then state of iron manufacture. Having former knowledge and delight in ironworks of my father's, when I was but a youth, afterwards at 20 years old was I fetched from Oxford, then of Balliol College, anno 1619, to look after and manage 3 ironworks of my father's, 1 furnace and 2 forges in the chase of Pensnell in Worcestershire, but wood and charcoal growing very scanty, and pit coals in great quantities abiding near the furnace, did induce me to alter my furnace, and to attempt by my new invention the making of iron with pit coal, and found at my trial or blast facere est adire inventione. After I had proved by a second blast and trial the feasibility of making iron with pit coal and with sea coal, I found by my new invention the quality good and profitable, but the quantity did not exceed above 3 tons a week. After this the inventor obtained a patent from King James I for 31 years in the 19th year of his reign. But the year following the grant there was so great a flood of rain, to this day called the great May Day flood, that it ruined the author's ironworks and inventions, and at a market town called Sturbridge, in Comitatu Vigoniae, 1 resolute man was carried from the bridge in the daytime. As soon as the author had repaired his works, he was commanded to send all sorts of bar iron up to the Tower of London, fit for the making of muskets and carbines. And the iron being so tried by artists and smiths, that the ironmasters and ironmongers who had complained that the author's iron was not merchantable were silenced until the 21st of King James. At the then Parliament all monopolies were made null, and divers of the ironmasters endeavoured to bring the invention of making iron with pit coal within the compass of a monopoly, but the Lord Dudley and the author did prevail, yet the patent was limited to continue but 14 years. This exception in the statute of monopolies, which incontestably proves the claim of the Dudley family to the honour of having invented the art of smelting iron with coal, runs in the following terms: provided also that this act shall not extend to or be prejudicial to a grant or privilege for the melting of iron ewer and of mauling the same into sea coals or pit coals, by his Majesty's letters patent under the Great Seal of England, made or granted to Edward Lord Dudley. After the passing of the act, it seems that Dudley made great store of iron and sold it at £12 a ton, and also cast iron wares, as brewing cisterns, pots, mortars, but being ousted of his works, he set up again a furnace at Himley, in the county of Stafford. Himley Hall is the present residence of Lord Ward, the representative of the Dudley family. From that time forward, the life of the unfortunate inventor was but one series of misfortunes. Under Charles I. he got into lawsuits, was the victim of riots set on by the charcoal ironmasters, and was eventually lodged in prison in the Compter. Then came the Great Rebellion, during which he had the disadvantage of being a royalist as well as an inventor, and having Cromwell, with Major Wildman and many of his officers, as opponents in rival experiments tried in the Forest of Dean, where they employed an ingenious glassmaster, Edward Dagney, an Italian, then living in Bristow, but they failed, and so he was utterly ruined. On the accession of Charles II. he petitioned, and eventually sent in the statement from which the preceding extracts have been made, but apparently without any success. The king was too busy making dukes and melting the louis d'or of his French pension to think of anything so common as iron or so tiresome as gratitude. The iron manufacture, for want of the art of smelting by coal and of a supply of wood, which the march of agriculture daily diminished, dwindled away, until in the middle of the 18th century it was revived at Colebrook Dale by the Darbys. In the intermediate period we were dependent on Russia, Spain, and Sweden for the chief part of the iron used in manufactures. But one of the most curious passages in Dudley's Metallum Martis is the following picture of the Dudley coalfield. Now let me show you some reasons that induced me to undertake these inventions, well knowing that within 10 miles of Dudley Castle there be near 20,000 smiths of all sorts, and many ironworks within that circle decayed for want of wood, yet formerly a mighty woodland country. Secondly, Lord Dudley's woods and works decayed, but pit coal and ironstone or mines abounding upon his lands, but of little use. Thirdly, because most of the coal mines in these parts are coals 10, 11, and 12 yards thick. Fourthly, under this great thickness of coals are many sorts of ironstone mines. Fifthly, that 1/3 part of the coals gotten under the ground are small, when the colliers are forced to sink pits for getting of 10 yards thick, and are of little use in an inland country, unless it might be made use of by making iron therewith. Sixthly, these colliers must cast these coals and slack out of their ways, which, becoming moist, heat naturally, and kindle in the middle of these great heaps, often setting the coal works on fire, and flaming out of the pits, and continue burning like Etna in Sicily, or Hecla in the Indies. At present, for more than 10 miles round Dudley Castle, ironworks of one kind or another are constantly at work. No remains of mighty woodland are to be found. The value of the 10-yard coal is fully appreciated, but the available quantity is far from having been worked out. The untouched mineral wealth of Lord Ward in this district was valued 10 years ago at £1,000,000 sterling. The small coal is no longer wasted, but carefully raised from the pits and conveyed by the numerous canals, tramroads, and railroads to ironworks, glassworks, and chemical works. But still heaps of waste, moistened by rain, do smoke by day, and flaming by night in conjunction with hundreds of fiery furnaces and natural gases blazing, do produce on a night's journey from Dudley to Wolverhampton not the effect of one Etna or Hecla, but of a broad inferno, from which even Dante might have gathered some burning notions. The political croakers who are constantly predicting that the last inevitable change, whether it be municipal corporation reform, a tithe commutation, or a corn tax repeal, will prove the ruin of England, should study the geographical march of our manufactures, and mark how, on the whole population, the rise of a new staple in one district, or the invention of a new art, constantly creates a new demand for labour. The exhaustion of our forests, instead of destroying, founded one great element of our world-wide commercial influence. We make no apology for this digression, knowing that to many minds facts connected with the rise of the iron trade will have as much interest as notes on the scene of a battle or the birthplace of a second-rate poet. Besides, as we omit to say what we do not know, it is necessary that we should say what we do. Besides mining and smelting iron ore, a considerable population in and around Dudley is engaged in the manufacture of glass and of nails, the latter being a domestic manufacture, at which men, women, and children all work at home. The castle dates from a Saxon prince, Dodo, A.D. 700, but like the bird of the same name, the original building is extinct. But very interesting ruins of a Norman gateway, tower, and keep are in existence, and form, with the caves, a show place leased by the South Staffordshire as an attraction to their excursion trains. The caves are lighted up on special occasions, and were honoured by a visit from the geologists of the British Association, when last they met at Birmingham. A fossil, called the Dudley locust, is found in great quantities and varieties in the limestone quarries, which form part of the mineral wealth of the neighbourhood. The broad gauge line through Birmingham and Oxford will shortly afford Dudley a direct and rapid communication with London. To passengers this will be a great convenience, but a mode of conveyance so unwieldy, clumsy, and costly is singularly ill fitted for a mineral district, as experience among the narrow tramways of the north has amply proved. Dudley returns one member to Parliament, whose politics must, it is supposed, be those of the holder of the Ward estate. Returning from Dudley through Walsall to Bescot Bridge, the rail pursues its course through a mining country to Bilston and Wolverhampton. On the road we pass in sight of the Birmingham Canal, one of the finest works of the kind in the kingdom. An enormous sum was spent in improving this navigation, in order to prove that any railway was unnecessary. The proprietors, under the influence of their officials, a snug family party, shut their eyes and spent their money in opposing the inevitable progress of locomotive power to the last possible moment. Even when the first London and Birmingham railway was nearly open, a scheme for a new canal was industriously hawked round the county, and although there were not enough subscribers found to execute the work, a small percentage was sufficient to furnish a surveyor's new house very handsomely. Still, there is no probability of the canal ever ceasing to be an important aid to the coal trade in heavy freights. Wednesbury, pronounced Wedgbury and spelt Wednesbury in Domesday Book, stands at the very heart of the coal and iron district, and is as like Tipton, Darlaston, Bilston, and other towns where the inhabitants are similarly employed, as one sweep is like another. Birmingham factors depend largely on Wedgbury for various kinds of ironwork and heavy steel toys. The coal pits in the neighbourhood are of great value, and there is no better place in the kingdom to buy a thoroughbred bulldog that will kill or die on it, but never turn tail. The name is supposed to incorporate that of the Saxon god Woden, whose worship consisted in getting drunk and fighting, and to this day that is the only kind of relaxation which many of the inhabitants ever indulge. The church stands upon a hill, where Ethelfleda, Lady of Mercia, built a castle to resist the Danes, A.D. 914, about the time that she erected similar bulwarks at Tamworth and other towns in the Midland counties, but there are no antiquities worth the trouble of visiting. Parties who take an interest in the progress of education in this kingdom, among those classes where it is most needed, that is to say, masses of miners and mechanics residing in districts from which all the higher and most of the middle classes have removed, where the clergy are few, hard worked, and ill paid, where the virtues of a thinly peopled agricultural district have been exchanged for the vices, without the refinements, of a crowded town population, should traverse this part of Staffordshire on foot. They will own that, in spite of the praiseworthy labours of both Church and Dissent, in spite of the progress of temperance societies and savings banks, a crowd of children are daily growing up in a state of ignorance, dirt, and degradation fearful to contemplate. To active philanthropists, not to seekers of the picturesque, archaeologists and antiquarians, do we address ourselves. Still, we ought to add that in the ironworks and rolling mills there are studies of half-naked men in active motion at night, with effect of red firelight and dark shade, in which the power of painting flesh and muscular development might be more effectively displayed than in the perpetual repetition of model Eves and sprawling nymphs. Wolverhampton formerly lay away from railroads at a convenient omnibus distance, but competition has doubly pierced it through and through. One line connects it with Shrewsbury, another on the point of completion will connect it with Dudley, Birmingham, and Oxford, and another with Worcester. Add to these means of communication the canals existing before railroads commenced, extending to Hull, Liverpool, Chester, and London, and it will be seen that Wolverhampton is most fortunately placed. The great railway battle of the gauges commenced at Wolverhampton, and has been carried on ever since at the cost of more than £1 million sterling in legal and parliamentary expenses, besides the waste of capital in constructing 3 railways where one would have been sufficient, and the extra cost of land traversed where a price was paid, first for the land, second for the revenue, third for compulsion, fourth for influence, and fifth for vote, if the landowner were a member of either House of Parliament. At the end of the battle, a competing line to London has been established, which will end shortly in a compromise, and if one district has 2 railways, others, much needing, have none. The shareholders on both sides have lost their money, the engineers have reaped a harvest, and the lawyers have realized a fortune. The experience of water companies, gas companies, canal companies, and railway companies has distinctly been that between great moneyed corporations with large capitals sunk in plant, competition is impossible and must end in a compromise. But these contests are profitable to lawyers, who must always win, whether their clients do or not. It is no exaggeration to say that as surely as Spain and Portugal are priest-ridden, so surely is Great Britain lawyer-ridden. No sooner does the science, the industry, and the enterprise of the country carve out some new road to commercial prosperity, than the attorney sets up a turnpike upon it and takes toll, and if dispute arises as to the right of the road, however the contest be decided, it ends in 2 attorneys taking toll. In Chancery, in the laws affecting patents of inventions, in the laws affecting canals, in railways, a standing army of lawyers are constantly engaged in fighting battles, which end in our bearing the wounds and their sharing the spoil. So it was in these battles of the gauges. But to return to Wolverhampton, the name of which recalled battles wherein so much useful money has been wasted, the town, although of rising importance in a commercial point, offers no other attraction to the curious traveller than its numerous manufactories of hardware and machinery of various kinds, including firearms, tinware, locks and keys of extraordinary cheapness, gunlocks, files, screws, and japanned-ware. The tea trays and other japanned-ware of Wolverhampton are equal in taste and execution to anything produced in Birmingham. Indeed, it was at the manufactory of the Messrs. Walden that the plan of skilfully copying the landscapes of our best artists on Japan were originated. The first tea tray of the kind was copied from one of Turner's Rivers of France, by a gentleman who has since taken up a very important position in applying the true principles of art to British manufactures. Wolverhampton and all the towns and villages in the coal and iron district are only so many branch Birminghams. In that hardware metropolis the greater part of the goods made are ordered and sold. The town is of great antiquity, although with as few remains as most flourishing towns built of brick, where manufactures have chased away mansions. The name is derived from Wulfrana, a sister of King Edgar, who founded a monastery there in A.D. 996, and collected a village round it, named Wulfrana Hampton, which was eventually corrupted into Wolverhampton. In the oldest church, St. Peter's, there is a pulpit formed of a single stone, elaborately sculptured, and a font with curious bas-relief figures of saints. The church is collegiate, and the college consists of a dean, who holds the prebend of Wolverhampton, which was annexed by Edward IV to his free chapel of St. George within the castle of Windsor. A free grammar school, supported by endowments, affords a headmaster £400 a year, the second master £200, and a third master £120. Some years ago these gentlemen had only 70 scholars to teach, but we trust this is or will be amended. Wolverhampton was made a parliamentary borough by the Reform Act, returning 2 members from boundaries which include the townships of Bilston, Willenhall, Wensfield, and the parish of Sedgeley. The population has increased more than 5-fold in the last 40 years. Bird, the artist, Congreve, inventor of the rockets which bear his name, and Abernethy, the eminent surgeon, were natives of Wolverhampton. Huskisson, who began the commercial reforms which Peel finished, was born at Oxley Hall in the immediate neighbourhood. Close to the town is a good racecourse, well frequented once a year, formerly one of the most fashionable meetings in the country. The ladies' division of the grandstand used to be a complete parterre of the gayest flowers, but railroads, which have added to the quantity, have very much deteriorated the quality of the frequenters of races, and unless a change takes place, a grandstand will soon be as dark, as busy, and as dull as the Stock Exchange. From Wolverhampton, a line 19 miles in length through Albrighton, where Staffordshire ends and Shropshire begins, and Shifnal to Wellington, shortens the route to Shrewsbury by cutting off an angle. But as there is nothing to be said about this route, except that at Albrighton are the kennels of the hunt of that name, a hunt in which the greater or less luxury and horseflesh of the young ironmasters affords a thermometer of the state of the iron trade, we shall on this occasion take the Stafford line. Within an easy distance of Wolverhampton are a very large number of the noblemen's and gentlemen's seats in which Staffordshire is so rich. More than one ancient and dilapidated family has been restored by the progress of smoke-creating manufactures, which have added to the wealth even more than they destroyed the picturesqueness of the country. If we were conducting a foreigner over England, with the view of showing him the wealth, the power, and the beauties of our country, we should follow exactly the course we have hitherto pursued, and after an exhausting inspection of the manufactories of the coal country, should turn off the rail, after leaving Wolverhampton, on our road to Stafford, and visit some of the beautiful mansions surrounded by that rich combination of nature and art which so eminently distinguishes the stately homes of England. For instance, before reaching Penkridge, we pass, on the right hand, Moseley Court, where the ancestors of the proprietors, the Whitgreaves, concealed Charles II after the Battle of Worcester. On the left, Wrottesley Hall, the seat of the scientific nobleman of that name, and Chellington Park, the residence of the ancient Roman Catholic family of the Giffords, where an avenue of oaks, the growth of centuries, with a magnificent domain stocked with deer and game, afford the admirers of English scenery delicious vistas of wood, water, and rich undulating pasture. The contrast between the murky atmosphere and continued roar of the iron-making country and the silence of the deer-haunted green glades is most striking and most grateful to eye and ear. As we rush along the valley of the Penk, too rapidly to drink in its full beauties, on the right Teddesley Hall, the mansion of Lord Hatherton, rising above the tops of the trees, reminds us that the noble lord's farms are well worth a visit from any one taking an interest in agriculture. Poor land has been rendered comparatively fertile, and by a complete system of drainage, mere marshy rush-growing meadows have been made capable of carrying capital root and wheat crops, while the waste water has been carried to a head, and then, by a large overshot water-wheel, working below the surface of the ground, made useful for thrashing, chaff and root cutting, and other operations of the farm. At Penkridge, a rural village of considerable antiquity, 10 miles from Wolverhampton, adorned by a Gothic church and several picturesque houses of the Elizabethan style of domestic architecture, it will be convenient to descend, if an expedition is intended, over Cannock Chase to Beaudesert, the seat of the Marquis of Anglesey. This Cannock Chase completes the singular variations of soil and occupation to be found in Staffordshire. From the densely populated iron districts and the model agriculture of disciples of the same school of Lord Hatherton, we can turn our faces to a vast moorland, 40 miles square, stretching from where it was first seen on the banks of the railway to the banks of the Trent, as wild as any part of Wales or Scotland, intersected by steep hills, by deep valleys covered with gorse and broom, dotted with peat marshes, tenanted by wild deer and feathered game, and fed over by the famous Kenk sheep, nearly as wild as deer, and in flavour rivalling the best mountain mutton. This great waste was once covered with dense forests, in which the wolf, the bear, the wild boar, and the wild bull were hunted by our Saxon kings. It is not among the least wonders effected by the locomotive that a short hour can transport us from the midst of the busiest centres of manufactures to a solitude as complete as is to be found in the prairies of America or Australia, unless we by chance stumble upon a prying gamekeeper or an idle rustic seeking whortleberries or snaring hares. On this chase, begged by his ancestors from an easy king as a kitchen garden, the hero of the light cavalry at Waterloo annually takes his sport, mounted on a perfect shooting cob, and with 80 years upon his shoulders can still manage to bring down his birds right and left. Long may such blanks of solitude and wild nature remain among the busy hum of commerce, to remind us of what all England once was, to afford at a few holidays in the year a free breathing space to the hard-working multitude, and to the poet and student that calm delight which the golden fragrance of a gorse-covered moor can bestow. Before we reach Stafford, we leave on the right, although not in sight, Shugborough, the deserted mansion of the Earl of Lichfield, a descendant of the Lord Anson, who sailed round the world, but was never in it. End of The Black Country by Samuel Sidney. Recording by Andy Minter.
The British Matron by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Read for LibriVox.org by Alan Davis Drake. I have heard a good deal of the tenacity with which English ladies retain their personal beauty to a late period in life, but, not to suggest that an American eye needs use and cultivation before it can quite appreciate the charm of an English beauty at any age, it strikes me that an English lady of 50 is apt to become a creature less refined and delicate, so far as her physique goes, than anything that we Western people class under the name of women. She has an awful ponderosity of frame, not pulpy like the looser development of our few fat women, but massive with solid beef and streaky tallow, so that, though struggling manfully against the idea, you inevitably think of her as made up of steaks and sirloins. When she walks, her advance is elephantine. When she sits down, it is on a great round space of her master's footstool, where she looks as if nothing could ever move her. She imposes awe and respect by the muchness of her personality, to such a degree that you probably credit her with far greater moral and intellectual force than she can fairly claim. Her visage is usually grim and stern, seldom positively forbidding, yet calmly terrible, not merely by its breadth and weight of feature, but because it seems to express so much well-defined self-reliance, such acquaintance with the world, its toils, troubles, and dangers, and such sturdy capacity for trampling down a foe, without anything positively salient, or actively offensive, or indeed unjustly formidable. To her neighbors she has the effect of a 24-gun ship in time of peace. For, while you assure yourself that there is no real danger, you cannot help thinking how tremendous would be her onset, if pugnaciously inclined, and how futile the effort to inflict any counter-injury. She certainly looks tenfold, nay, 100-fold, better able to take care of herself than our slender-framed and haggard womankind. But I have not found reason to suppose that the English dowager of 50 has actually greater courage, fortitude, and strength of character than our women of similar age, or even a tougher physical endurance than they. Morally, she is strong, I suspect, only in society, and in the common routine of social affairs, and would be found powerless and timid in any exceptional strait that might call for energy outside of the conventionalities amid which she has grown up. You can meet this figure in the street and live, and even smile at the recollection, but conceive of her in the ballroom, with the bare brawny arms that she invariably displays there, and all the other corresponding development, such as is beautiful in the maiden blossom, but a spectacle to howl at in such an overblown cabbage rose as this. Yet somewhere in this enormous bulk there must be hidden the modest, slender, violet nature of a girl, whom an alien mass of earthiness has unkindly overgrown. For an English maiden in her teens, though very seldom so pretty as our own damsels, possesses, to say the truth, a certain charm of half-blossom and delicately folded leaves, and tender womanhood, shielded by maidenly reserves, with which, somehow or other, our American girls often fail to adorn themselves during an appreciable moment. It is a pity that the English violet should grow into such an outrageously developed peony as I have attempted to describe. I wonder whether a middle-aged husband ought to be considered as legally married to all the accretions that have overgrown the slenderness of this bride since he led her to the altar, and which make her so much more than he ever bargained for. Is it not a sounder view of the case that the matrimonial bond cannot be held to include the 3/4 of the wife that had no existence when the ceremony was performed? And, as a matter of conscience and good morals, ought not an English married pair to insist upon the celebration of a silver wedding at the end of 25 years, in order to legalize and mutually appropriate that corporeal growth with which both parties have individually come into possession since they were pronounced one flesh? End of the British Matron. This recording is in the public domain.
Constitution of the State of California of 1849, Article 1, Declaration of Rights. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Article 1, Declaration of Rights. Section 1. All men are by nature free and independent, and have certain inalienable rights, among which are those of enjoying and defending life and liberty, acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, and pursuing and obtaining safety and happiness. Section 2. All political power is inherent in the people. Government is instituted for the protection, security, and benefit of the people, and they have the right to alter or reform the same whenever the public good may require it. Section 3. The right of trial by jury shall be secured to all, and remain inviolable forever, but a jury trial may be waived by the parties in all civil cases in the manner to be prescribed by law. Section 4. The free exercise and enjoyment of religious profession and worship, without discrimination or preference, shall forever be allowed in this state, and no person shall be rendered incompetent to be a witness on account of his opinions on matters of religious belief. But the liberty of conscience, hereby secured, shall not be so construed as to excuse acts of licentiousness or justify practices inconsistent with the peace or safety of this state. Section 5. The privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when, in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require its suspension. Section 6. Excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor shall cruel or unusual punishments be inflicted, nor shall witnesses be unreasonably detained. Section 7. All persons shall be bailable by sufficient sureties, unless for capital offenses, when the proof is evident or the presumption great. Section 8. No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime, except in cases of impeachment, and in cases of militia when in actual service, and the land naval forces in time of war, or which this state may keep with the consent of Congress in time of peace, and in cases of petty larceny under the regulation of the legislature, unless on presentment or indictment of a grand jury. and in any trial in any court whatever, the party accused shall be allowed to appear and defend in person and with counsel, as in civil actions. No person shall be subject to be twice put jeopardy for the same offense, nor shall he be compelled, in any criminal case, to be a witness against himself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. Section 9. Every citizen may freely speak, write, and publish his sentiments on all subjects, being responsible for the abuse of that right, and no law shall be passed to restrain or abridge the liberty of speech or of the press. In all criminal prosecutions on indictments for libel, the truth may be given in evidence to the jury, and if it shall appear to the jury that the matter charged as libelous is true, and was published with good motives and for justifiable ends, the party shall be acquitted, and the jury shall have the right to determine the law and the fact. Section 10. The people shall have the right freely to assemble together, to consult for the common good, to instruct their representatives, and to petition the legislature for redress of grievances. Section 11. All laws of a general nature shall have a uniform operation. Section 12. The military shall be subordinate to the civil power. No standing army shall be kept up by this state in time of peace, and in time of war no appropriation for a standing army shall be for a longer time than 2 years. Section 13. No soldier shall, in time of peace, be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war except in the manner to be prescribed by law. Section 14. Representation shall be apportioned according to population. Section 15. No person shall be imprisoned for debt in any civil action on mean or final process, unless in cases of fraud, and no person shall be imprisoned for a militia fine in time of peace. Section 16. No bill of attainder, ex post facto law, or law impairing the obligation of contracts shall ever be passed. Section 17. Foreigners who are, or who may hereafter become bona fide residents of this state, shall enjoy the same rights in respect to the possession, enjoyment, and inheritance of property as native-born citizens. Section 18. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, unless for the punishment of crimes, shall ever be tolerated in this state. Section 19. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects, against unreasonable seizures and searches, shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but on probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons and things to be seized. Section 20. Treason against the state shall consist only in levying war against it, adhering to its enemies, or giving them aid and comfort. No person shall be convicted of treason unless the evidence of 2 witnesses to the same overt act, or confession in open court. Section 21. This enumeration of rights shall not be construed to impair or deny others retained by the people. End of Constitution of the State of California, 1849, Article 1, Declaration of Rights. Recording by Elaine Hamby in California.
The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County by Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County by Mark Twain, 1835 to 1910. From The Saturday Press, November 18, 1865. Republished in The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County and Other Sketches, 1867, by Mark Twain, all of whose works are published by Harper and Brothers. In compliance with the request of a friend of mine, who wrote me from the East, I called on good-natured, garrulous old Simon Wheeler, and inquired after my friend's friend, Leonidas W. Smiley, as requested to do, and I hereunto append the result. I have a lurking suspicion that Leonidas W. Smiley is a myth, and that my friend never knew such a personage, and that he only conjectured that if I asked old Wheeler about him, it would remind him of his infamous Jim Smiley, and he would go to work and bore me to death with some exasperating reminiscence of him as long and as tedious as it should be useless to me. If that was the design, it succeeded. I found Simon Wheeler dozing comfortably by the bar-room stove of the dilapidated tavern in the decaying mining camp of Angels, and I noticed that he was fat and bald-headed, and had an expression of winning gentleness and simplicity upon his tranquil countenance. He roused up and gave me good day. I told him a friend had commissioned me to make some inquiries about a cherished companion of his boyhood, named Leonidas W. Smiley, Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, a young minister of the gospel, who he had heard was at one time a resident of Angel's Camp. I added that if Mr. Wheeler could tell me anything about this Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, I would feel under many obligations to him. Simon Wheeler backed me into a corner and blockaded me there with his chair, and then sat down and reeled off the monotonous narrative which follows this paragraph. He never smiled, he never frowned, he never changed his voice from the gentle flowing key to which he tuned his initial sentence, he never betrayed the slightest suspicion of enthusiasm, but all through the interminable narrative there ran a vein of impressive earnestness and sincerity, which showed me plainly that, so far from his imagining that there was anything ridiculous or funny about his story, he regarded it as a really important matter, and admired its two heroes as men of transcendent genius in finesse. I let him go on in his own way, and never interrupted him once. Reverend Leonidas W. Reverend Lee... Well, there was a feller here once by the name of Jim Smiley in the winter of '49, or maybe it was the spring of '50, I don't recollect exactly, somehow, though what makes me think it was one or the other is because I remember the big flume wasn't finished when he first came to the camp, but anyway, he was the curiousest man about always betting on anything that turned up you ever see, if he could get anybody to bet on the other side, and if he couldn't, he'd change sides. Any way that suited the other man would suit him. Anyway, just so's he got a bet, he was satisfied. But still he was lucky, uncommonly lucky. He most always come out winner. He was always ready and laying for a chance. There couldn't be no solitary thing mentioned but that feller'd offer to bet on it, and take any side you please, as I was just telling you. If there was a horse race, you'd find him flush or you'd find him busted at the end of it. If there was a dog fight, he'd bet on it. If there was a cat fight, he'd bet on it. If there was a chicken fight, he'd bet on it. Why, if there was two birds setting on a fence, he would bet you which one would fly first. Or if there was a camp meeting, he would be there regular to bet on Parson Walker, which he judged to be the best exhorter about here, and he was, too, and a good man. If he even see a straddle-bug start to go anywheres, he would bet you how long it would take him to get to wherever he was going to, and if you took him up, he would foller that straddle-bug to Mexico, but what he would find out where he was bound for, and how long he was on the road. Lots of the boys here has seen that Smiley, and can tell you about him. Why, it never made no difference to him. He'd bet on anything. The dangest feller. Parson Walker's wife laid very sick once, for a good while, and it seemed as if they warn't going to save her, but one morning he came in, and Smiley up and asked him how she was, and he said she was considerable better, thank the Lord for his infinite mercy, and coming on so smart that with the blessing of Providence she'd get well yet, and Smiley, before he thought, says, "Well, I'll risk 2.5 she don't, anyway." This 'ere Smiley had a mare. The boys called her the 15-minute nag, but that was only in fun, you know, because, of course, she was faster than that, and he used to win money on that horse, for all she was so slow and always had the asthma, or the distemper, or the consumption, or something of that kind. They used to give her 200 or 300 yards start, and then pass her under way, but always at the fag end of the race she'd get excited and desperate-like, and come cavorting and straddling up, and scattering her legs around limber, sometimes in the air, and sometimes out to one side amongst the fences, and kicking up more dust and raising more racket with her coughing and sneezing and blowing her nose, and always fetch up at the stand just about a neck ahead, as near as you could cipher it down. And he had a little small bull pup, that to look at him you'd think he warn't worth a cent, but to set around and look ornery and lay for a chance to steal something. But as soon as money was up on him he was a different dog. His under jaw'd begin to stick out like the forecastle of a steamboat, and his teeth would uncover and shine like the furnaces. And a dog might tackle him, and bullyrag him, and bite him, and throw him over his shoulder 2 or 3 times, and Andrew Jackson, which was the name of the pup, Andrew Jackson would never let on but what he was satisfied, and hadn't expected nothing else, and the bets being doubled and doubled on the other side all the time, till the money was all up, and then all of a sudden he would grab that other dog just by the joint of his hind leg and freeze to it. Not chaw, you understand, but only just grip, and hang on till they throwed up the sponge, if it was a year. Smiley always come out a winner on that pup, till he harnessed a dog once that didn't have no hind legs, because they'd been sawed off in a circular saw, and when the thing had gone along far enough, and the money was all up, and he come to make a snatch for his pet holt, he see in a minute how he'd been imposed on, and how the other dog had him in the door, so to speak, and he 'peared surprised, and then he looked sorter discouraged like, and didn't try no more to win the fight, and so he got shucked out bad. He gave Smiley a look, as much as to say his heart was broke, and it was his fault for putting up a dog that hadn't no hind legs for him to take hold of, which was his main dependence in a fight, and then he limped off a piece and laid down and died. It was a good pup, was that Andrew Jackson, and would have made a name for hisself if he'd lived, for the stuff was in him, and he had genius. I know it, because he hadn't no opportunities to speak of, and it don't stand to reason that a dog could make such a fight as he could under them circumstances if he hadn't no talent. It always makes me feel sorry when I think of that last fight of his'n, and the way it turned out. Well, this 'ere Smiley had rat terriers, and chicken cocks, and tom cats, and all of them kind of things, till you couldn't rest, and you couldn't fetch nothing for him to bet on but he'd match you. He ketched a frog one day and took him home, said he'd calculated to educate him, and so he never done nothing for 3 months but set in his backyard and learn that frog to jump. And you bet he did learn him too. He'd give him a little punch behind, and the next minute you'd see that frog whirling in the air like a doughnut, see him turn one somerset, or maybe a couple if he got a good start, and come down flat-footed and all right like a cat. He got him up so in the matter of catching flies, and kep him in practice so constant, that he'd nail a fly every time as fur as he could see him. Smiley said all a frog wanted was education, and he could do most anything, and I believe him. Why, I've seen him set Dan'l Webster down here on this floor, Dan'l Webster was the name of the frog, and sing out, "Flies, Dan'l, flies," and quicker'n you could wink he'd spring straight up and snake a fly off'n the counter there, and flop down on the floor agin as solid as a gob of mud, and fall to scratching the side of his head with his hind foot as indifferent as if he hadn't no idea he'd been doing any more'n a frog might do. You never see a frog so modest and straightforward as he was, for all he was so gifted. And when it come to fair and square jumping on a dead level, he could get over more ground at one straddle than any animal of his breed you ever see. Jumping on a dead level was his strong suit, you understand, and when it come to that, Smiley would ante up money on him as long as he had a red. Smiley was monstrous proud of his frog, and well he might be, for fellers that had travelled and been everywheres all said he laid over any frog that ever they see. Well, Smiley kept the beast in a little lattice box, and he used to fetch him downtown sometimes and lay for a bet. One day a feller, a stranger in the camp he was, come across him with his box and says, "What might be that you've got in the box?" And Smiley says, sorter indifferent like, "It might be a parrot, or it might be a canary, maybe, but it ain't. It's only just a frog." And the feller took it, and looked at it careful, and turned it round this way and that, and says, "So 'tis. Well, what's he good for?" "Well," Smiley says, easy and careless, "he is good enough for one thing, I should judge. He can outjump any frog in Calaveras County." The feller took the box again, and took another long, particular look, and gave it back to Smiley, and says, very deliberate, "Well," he says, "I don't see no p'ints about that frog that's any better'n any other frog." "Maybe you don't," Smiley says. "Maybe you understand frogs, and maybe you don't understand 'em. Maybe you've had experience, and maybe you ain't only a amateur, as it were. Anyways, I've got my opinion, and I'll risk $40 that he can outjump any frog in Calaveras County." And the feller studied a minute, and then says, kinder sad like, "Well, I'm only a stranger here, and I ain't got no frog, but if I had a frog, I'd bet you." And then Smiley says, "That's all right, that's all right. If you'll hold my box a minute, I'll go and get you a frog." And so the feller took the box, and put up his $40 along with Smiley's, and set down to wait. So he set there a good while, thinking and thinking to hisself, and then he got the frog out, and prized his mouth open, and took a teaspoon and filled him full of quail shot, filled him pretty near up to his chin, and set him on the floor. Smiley he went to the swamp and slopped around in the mud for a long time, and finally he ketched a frog and fetched him in, and gave him to this feller, and he says, "Now, if you're ready, set him alongside of Dan'l, with his fore paws just even with Dan'l's, and I'll give the word." Then he says, "1, 2, 3, git!" And him and the feller touched up the frogs from behind, and the new frog hopped off lively, but Dan'l give a heave and histed up his shoulders, so, like a Frenchman, but it warn't no use, he couldn't budge, he was planted as solid as a church, and he couldn't no more stir than if he was anchored out. Smiley was a good deal surprised, and he was disgusted too, but he didn't have no idea what the matter was, of course. The feller took the money and started away, and when he was going out at the door he sorta jerked his thumb over his shoulder, so, at Dan'l, and says again, very deliberate, "Well," he says, "I don't see no p'ints about that frog that's any better'n any other frog." Smiley he stood scratching his head and looking down at Dan'l a long time, and at last says, "I do wonder what in the nation that frog throwed off for. I wonder if there ain't something the matter with him. He 'pears to look mighty baggy somehow." And he ketched Dan'l up by the nape of the neck and hefted him, and says, "Why, blame my cats if he don't weigh 5 pounds," and turned him upside down, and he belched out a double handful of shot, and then he see how it was, and he was the maddest man. He set the frog down and took out after that feller, but he never ketched him, and— Here Simon Wheeler heard his name called from the front yard, and got up to see what was wanted, and turning to me as he moved away, he said, "Just set where you are, stranger, and rest easy. I ain't going to be gone a second." But, by your leave, I did not think that a continuation of the history of the enterprising vagabond Jim Smiley would be likely to afford me much information concerning the Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, and so I started away. At the door I met the sociable Wheeler returning, and he buttonholed me and recommenced. "Well, this 'ere Smiley had a yaller, one-eyed cow that didn't have no tail, only just a short stump like a banana, and—" However, lacking both time and inclination, I did not wait to hear about the afflicted cow, and took my leave. End of The Celebrated Jumping Frog, of Calaveras County by Mark Twain. Read by Kara Shallenberg, www.kray.org, on October 31st, 2007. I grew up in Calaveras County.
The Cliff Dwellers, from Arizona Sketches, Chapter 12, by Joseph A. Monk. Read for LibriVox.org by James Christopher, in Phoenix, Arizona, USA. In the canyons of the Colorado River and its tributaries are found the ruins of an ancient race of cliff dwellers. These ruins are numerous and are scattered over a wide scope of country, which includes Arizona and portions of Utah, Colorado, and New Mexico. Many of them are yet in a good state of preservation, but all show the marks of age and decay. They are not less than 400 years old, and are, in all probability, much older. Their preservation is largely due to their sheltered position among the rocks and an exceptionally dry climate. The houses are invariably built upon high cliffs on shelving rocks in places that are almost inaccessible. In some instances, they can only be reached by steps cut into the solid rock, which are so old and worn that they are almost obliterated. Their walls so nearly resemble the stratified rocks upon which they stand that they are not easily distinguished from their surroundings. The cliffs are often sloping, sometimes overhanging, but more frequently perpendicular. The weather erosion of many centuries has caused the softer strata of exposed rocks in the cliffs to disintegrate and fall away, which left numberless caverns wherein this ancient and mysterious people chose to build their eyrie homes to live with the eagles. The houses are built of all shapes and sizes, and, apparently, were planned to fit the irregular and limited space of their environment. Circular watchtowers look down from commanding heights which, from their shape and position, were evidently intended to serve the double purpose of observation and defense. In the search for evidence of their antiquity, it is believed that data has been found which denotes great age. In the construction of some of their houses, notably those in the Mancos Canon, is displayed a technical knowledge of architecture and the mathematical accuracy which savages do not possess, and the fine masonry of dressed stone and superior cement seem to prove that Indians were not the builders. On the contrary, to quote a recent writer, the evidence goes to show that the work was done by skilled workmen who were white masons and who built for white people in a prehistoric age. In this connection it is singular, if not significant, that the natives, when first discovered, believed in a bearded white man whom they deified as the fair god, of whose existence they had obtained knowledge from some source, and in whose honor they kept their sacred altar fires burning unquenched. The relics that have been found in the ruins are principally implements of the Stone Age, but are of significant variety to indicate a succession of races that were both primitive and cultured, and as widely separated in time as in knowledge. The cliff dwellings were not only the abodes of their original builders, but were occupied and deserted successively by the chipped stone implement maker, the polisher of hard stone, the basket maker, and the weaver. Among the relics that have been found in the ruins are some very fine specimens of pottery which are as symmetrical and well finished as if they had been turned on a potter's wheel, and covered with an opaque enamel of stanniferous glaze composed of lead and tin that originated with the Phoenicians and is as old as history. Can it be possible that the cliff dwellers are a lost fragment of Egyptian civilization? The cliff ruins in Arizona are not only found in the canyons of the Colorado River, but also in many other places. The finest of them are Montezuma's Castle on Beaver Creek and the Casa Blanca in Canyon de Chelly. Numerous other ruins are found on the Rio Verde, Gila River, Walnut Canyon, and elsewhere. The largest and finest group of cliff dwellings are those on the Mesa Verde in Colorado. They are fully described in the great work of Nordenskjöld, who spent much time among them. The different houses are named after some peculiarity of appearance or construction, like the Cliff Palace, which contains more than 100 rooms, Long House, Balcony House, Spruce Tree House, etc. He obtained a large quantity of relics, which are also fully described, consisting of stone implements, pottery, cotton and feather cloth, oster and palmino mats, yucca sandals, weaving sticks, bone awls, corn, and beans. Many well-preserved mummies were found buried in graves that were carefully closed and sealed. The bodies were wrapped in a fine cotton cloth of drawn work, which was covered by a coarser cloth resembling burlap, and all enclosed in a wrapping of palmino matting tied with a cord made of the fiber of cedar bark. The hair is fine and of a brown color, and not coarse and black like the hair of the wild Indians. Mummies have been exhumed that have red or light-colored hair, such as usually goes with a fair skin. This fact has led some to believe that the cliff dwellers belong to the white race, but not necessarily so. as this quality of hair also belongs to albinos, who doubtless lived among the cliff dwellers as they do among the Mokees and Zunis at the present day, and explains the peculiarity of hair just mentioned. These remains may be very modern, as some choose to believe, but in all probability they are more ancient than modern. Mummies encased in wood and cloth have been taken from the tombs of Egypt in an almost perfect state of preservation which cannot be less than 2,000 years old, and are perhaps more than double that age. As there is no positive knowledge as to when the cliff dwellers flourished, one man's guess on the subject is as good as another's. An important discovery was recently made near Mancos, Colorado, where a party of explorers found in some old cliff dwellings graves beneath graves that were entirely different from anything yet discovered. They were egg-shaped, built of stone and plastered smoothly with clay. They contained mummies, cloth sandals, beads, and various other trinkets. There was no pottery, but many well-made baskets, and their owners had been called the basket makers. There was also a difference in the skulls found. The cliff dweller's skull is short and flattened behind, while the skulls that were found in these old graves were long, narrow, and round on the back. Reverend H. M. Baum, who has traveled all over the Southwest and visited every large ruin in the country, considers that Canon de Chele and its branch, Del Muerto, is the most interesting prehistoric locality in the United States. The Navajos, who now live in the Canon, have a tradition that the people who occupied the old cliff houses were all destroyed in one day by a wind of fire. The occurrence, evidently, was similar to what happened recently on the island of Martinique, when all the inhabitants of the village of St. Pierre perished in an hour by the eruption of Mont Pelee. Contemporaneous with the cliff dwellers, there seemed to have lived a race of people in the adjoining valleys who built cities and tilled the soil. Judged by their works, they must have been an industrious, intelligent, and numerous people. All over the ground are strewn broken pieces of pottery that are painted in bright colors and artistic designs which, after ages of exposure to the weather, look as fresh as if newly made. The relics that have been taken from the ruins are similar to those found in the cliff houses, and consist mostly of stone implements and pottery. In the Gila Valley, near the town of Florence, stands the now famous Casa Grande ruin, which is the best preserved of all these ancient cities. It was a ruin when the Spaniards first discovered it, and is a type of the ancient communal house. Its thick walls are composed of a concrete adobe that is as hard as rock, and its base lines conform to the cardinal points of the compass. It is an interesting relic of a past age and an extinct race, and, if it cannot yield up its secrets to science, it at least appeals to the spirit of romance and mystery. Irrigating ditches which were fed from reservoirs supplied their fields and houses with water. Portions of these old canals are yet in existence and furnish proof of the diligence and skill of their builders. The ditches were located on levels that could not be improved upon for utilizing the land and water to the best advantage. Modern engineers have not been able to better them, and in many places the old levels are used in new ditches at the present time. Whatever may have been the fate of this ancient people, their destruction must be sought in natural causes rather than by human warfare. An adverse fate probably cut off their water supply and laid waste their productive fields. With their crops a failure and all supplies gone, what else could the people do but either starve or move? But as to the nature of the Exodus, history is silent. Just how ancient these works are might be difficult to prove, but they are certainly not modern. The evidence denotes that they have existed a long time. Where the water in a canal flowed over solid rock, the rock has been much worn. Portions of the old ditches are filled with lava, and houses lie buried in the vitreous flood. It is certain that the country was inhabited prior to the last lava flow, whether that event occurred hundreds or thousands of years ago. It is claimed that the Pueblo Indians and cliff dwellers are identical, and that the latter were driven from their peaceful valley homes by a hostile foe to find temporary shelter among the rocks. But such a conclusion seems to be erroneous in view of certain facts. The cliff dwellings were not temporary camps, as such a migration would imply, but places of permanent abode. The houses are too numerous and well constructed to be accounted for on any other hypothesis. A people fleeing periodically to the cliffs to escape from an enemy could not have built such houses. Indeed, they are simply marvelous when considered as to location and construction. The time that must necessarily have been consumed in doing the work, and the amount of danger and labor involved, labor in preparing and getting the material into place, and danger in scaling the dizzy heights over an almost impassable trail. It seems the boldest assumption to assert that the work was done by a fleeing and demoralized mob. Again, it would be a physical impossibility for a people who were only accustomed to agricultural pursuits to suddenly and completely change their habits of life such as living among the rocks would necessitate. Only by native instinct and daily practice from childhood would it be possible for any people to follow the narrow and difficult paths which were habitually traveled by the cliff dwellers. It requires a clear head and steady nerves to perform the daring feat in safety, to the truth of which statement modern explorers can testify who have made the attempt in recent years at the peril of life and limb while engaged in searching for archaeological treasures. Judged by the everyday life that is familiar to us, it seems incredible that houses should ever have been built or homes established in such hazardous places, or that any people should ever have lived there, but that they did is an established fact, as there stands the houses which were built and occupied by human beings in the midst of surroundings that might appall the stoutest heart. Children played, and men and women wrought on the brink of frightful precipices in space so limited and dangerous that a single misstep made it fatal. It is almost impossible to conceive of any condition in life, or combination of circumstances in the affairs of men, that should drive any people to the rash act of living in the houses of the cliff-dwellers. Men will sometimes do from choice what they cannot be made to do by compulsion. It is easier to believe that the cliff-dwellers, being free people, chose of their own accord the site of their habitation rather than that from any cause they were compelled to make the choice. Their preference was to live upon the cliffs, as they were fitted by nature for such an environment. For no other reason, apparently, do the Moquis live upon their rocky and barren mesas away from everything which the civilized white man deems desirable, yet in seeming contentment. The Supais, likewise, choose to live alone at the bottom of Cataract Canon, where they are completely shut in by high cliffs. Their only road out is by a narrow and dangerous trail up the side of the canon, which is little traveled as they seldom leave home and are rarely visited. To affirm that the cliff-dwellers were driven from their strongholds and dispersed by force is pure fiction, nor is there any evidence to support such a theory. That they had enemies no one doubts, but, being in possession of an impregnable position where one man could successfully withstand 1,000, to surrender would have been base cowardice, and weakness was not a characteristic of the cliff-dwellers. The question of their sustenance is likewise a puzzle. They evidently cultivated the soil where it was practicable to do so, as fragments of farm products have been found in their dwellings, but in the vicinity of some of the houses there is no tillable land, and the inhabitants must have depended upon other means for support. The wild game, which was doubtless abundant, furnished them with meat and edible seeds, fruit and roots from native plants like the pinyon pine and mesquite, which together with saguaro and mescal, supplied them with a variety of food sufficient for their subsistence as they do, in measure, the wild Indian tribes of that region at the present day. End of The Cliff Dwellers. From Arizona Sketches, Chapter 12, by Joseph A. Monk. This recording is in the public domain.
The Devil's Dance Chamber. From Myths and Legends of Our Own Land, Volume 1, The Hudson and Its Hills, by Charles M. Skinner. Read for LibriVox.org by M. L. Cohen, originally from Newburgh, New York, United States of America. Most storied of our New World rivers is the Hudson. Historic scenes have been enacted on its shores, and Indian, Dutchman, Briton, and American have invested it with romance. It had its source, in the red man's fancy, in a spring of eternal youth. Giants and spirits dwell in its woods and hills, and before the river, Shattamook, king of streams the red man called it, had broken through the highlands, those mountains were a pent for spirits who had rebelled against the Manitou. After the waters had forced a passage to the sea, these evil ones sought shelter in the glens and valleys that opened to the right and left along its course. But in time of tempest, when they hear Manitou riding down the ravine on wings of storm, dashing thunderbolts against the cliffs, it is the fear that he will recapture them and force them into lightless caverns to expiate the revolt that sends them huddling among the rocks and makes the hills resound with roars and howls. At the Devil's Dance Chamber, a slight plateau on the west bank, between Newburgh and Crom Elbow, the red men performed semi-religious rites as a preface to their hunting and fishing trips or ventures on the warpath. They built a fire, painted themselves, and in that frenzy into which savages are so readily lashed, and that is so like to the action of mobs in trousers, they tumbled, leaped, danced, yelled, sang, grimaced, and gesticulated until the Manitou disclosed himself, either as a harmless animal or a beast of prey. If he came in the former shape, the augury was favorable. But if he showed himself as a bear or panther, it was a warning of evil that they seldom dared to disregard. The crew of Hudson's ship, the Half Moon, having chanced on one of these orgies, were so impressed by the fantastic spectacle that they gave the name Duivels dan Kamer to the spot. Years afterward, when Stuyvesant ascended the river, His dowdy retainers were horrified on landing below Danskammer to discover hundreds of painted figures frisking there in the firelight. A few surmised that they were but a new generation of savages holding a powwow, but most of the sailors fancied that the assemblage was demonic, and that the figures were spirits of bad Indians repeating a scalp dance and reveling in the mysterious firewater that they had brought down from the river source in jars and skins. The spot was at least once profaned with blood, for a young Dutchman and his wife of Albany were captured here by an angry Indian, and although the young man succeeded in stabbing his captor to death, he was burned alive on the rock by the friends of the Indians whose wrath he had provoked. The wife, after being kept in captivity for some time, was ransomed. End of story. This recording is in the public domain.
The First World War. Selections from the Manchester Guardian. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Carl Manchester 2007. Tuesday, August the 18th, 1914. Proposed Battalion of Manchester Clerks and Warehousemen. The following is a copy of an announcement that Manchester employers are being asked to sign and post up, calling upon employees for voluntary service. A battalion is being raised, composed entirely of employees in Manchester's offices and warehouses, upon the ordinary conditions of enlistment in Lord Kitchener's army, namely, for 3 years or the duration of the war. The battalion will be clothed and equipped, excepting arms, by a fund being raised for the purpose. We therefore desire to call the attention of all our employees between the ages of 19 and 35 years to the call of Lord Kitchener, which was emphasised by the Prime Minister in the House of Commons, for further recruits, and in order to encourage enlistment, we are prepared to offer all employees enlisting within the next 2 weeks the following conditions. 1. 4 weeks full wages from date of leaving. 2. Re-engagement on discharge from service, guaranteed. 3. Half pay during absence on duty for married men from the date that full pay ceases, to be paid to the wife. 4. Special arrangements made for single men who have relatives entirely dependent on them. 5. The above payments only apply to those enlisting in the ranks, and not to anyone who may obtain a commission otherwise than by promotion from the ranks, but each case, if any, of those obtaining a commission will be treated on its merits. 6. The above offer is for voluntary service only, and should the government decide on compulsory training later, the offer will not apply to those affected by such compulsion. Names should be sent to your employer. Recruiting for this battalion will take place at the Artillery Headquarters, Hyde Road, Ardwick, daily from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. It is hoped that all employers will fall in with the above scheme and do all they can to encourage their employees to enlist. Tuesday, August 18th, 1914. With the Guns. D. H. Lawrence. The reservists were leaving for London by the 9 o'clock train. They were young men, some of them drunk. There was one bawling and brawling before the ticket window. There were two swaying on the steps of the subway shouting, and ending, "Let's go and have another afore we go." There were a few women seeing off their sweethearts and brothers, but on the whole the reservist had been a lodger in the town, and had only his own pals. One woman stood before the carriage window. She and her sweetheart were being very matter-of-fact, cheerful and bumptious over the parting. "Well, so long," she cried, as the train began to move. "When you see 'em, let 'em have it." "Aye, no fear," shouted the man, and the train was gone, the man grinning. I thought what it would really be like when he saw 'em. Last autumn I followed the Bavarian army down the Isar Valley and near the foot of the Alps. Then I could see what war would be like, an affair entirely of machines, with men attached to the machines as the subordinate part thereof, as the butt is a part of the rifle. I remember standing on a little round hill one August afternoon. There was a beautiful blue sky and white clouds from the mountains. Away on the right, amid woods and corn-clad hills, lay the big Starnberg Lake. This is just a year ago, but it seems to belong to some period outside of time. On the crown of the little hill were 3 quick-firing guns, with the gunners behind. At the side, perched on a tiny platform at the top of a high pair of steps, was an officer looking through a fixed spyglass. A little further behind, lower down the hill, was a group of horses and soldiers. Every moment came the hard, tearing, hideous voice of the German command from the officer perched aloft, giving the range of the guns, and then the sharp cry, "Fire!" There was a burst. Something in the guns started back. The faintest breath of vapour disappeared. The shots had gone. I watched, but I could not see where they had gone, nor what had been aimed at. Evidently, they were directed against an enemy 1.5 miles away, men unseen by any of the soldiers at the guns. Whether the shot they fired hit or missed, killed or did not touch, I and the gun party did not know. Only the officer was shouting the range again. The guns were again starting back. We were again staring over the face of the green and dappled, inscrutable country into which the missiles sped, unseen. What work was there to do? Only mechanically to adjust the guns and fire the shot. What was there to feel? Only the unnatural suspense and suppression of serving a machine which, for aught we knew, was killing our fellow men, whilst we stood there, blind, without knowledge or participation, subordinate to the cold machine. This was the glamour and the glory of the war. Blue sky overhead and living green country all around, but we, amid it all, apart in some iron insensate will, our flesh and blood, our soul and intelligence shed away, and all that remained of us, a cold, metallic adherence to an iron machine. There was neither ferocity, nor joy, nor exultation, nor exhilaration, nor even quick fear, only a mechanical, expressionless movement. And this is how the gunner would let 'em have it. He would mechanically move a certain apparatus when he heard a certain shout. Of the result he would see and know nothing. He had nothing to do with it. Then I remember going at night down a road, whilst the sound of guns thudded continuously, and suddenly I started seeing the bank of the road stir. It was a mass of scarcely visible forms, lying waiting for a rush. They were lying under fire, silent, scarcely stirring, a mass. If one of the shells that were supposed to be coming had dropped among them, it would have burst a hole in the mass. Who would have been torn, killed, no one would have known. There would just have been a hole in the living shadowy mass. That was all. Who it was did not matter. There were no individuals, and every individual soldier knew it. He was a fragment of a mass, and as a fragment of a mass he must live and die, or be torn. He had no rights, no self, no being. There was only the mass lying there, solid and obscure, along the bank of the road in the night. This was how the gunner would let 'em have it. A shell would fall into this mass of vulnerable bodies. There would be a torn hole in the mass. This would be his letting 'em have it. And I remember a captain of the Bersaglieri who talked to me in the train in Italy when he had come back from Tripoli. The Italian soldier, he said, was the finest soldier in the world at a rush. But, and he spoke with a certain horror that cramped his voice, when it came to lying there under the Snider fire, you had to stand behind them with a revolver. And I saw he could not get beyond the agony of this. Well, I said, that is because they cannot feel themselves part of a machine. They have all the old natural courage when one rushes at one's enemy, but it is unnatural to them to lie still under machine fire. It is unnatural to anybody. War with machines, and the machine predominant, is too unnatural for an Italian. It is a wicked thing, a machine, and your Italians are too naturally good. They will do anything to get away from it. Let us see our enemy and go for him. But we cannot endure this taking death out of machines and giving death out of machines, our blood cold, without any enemy to rise against. I remember also standing on a little hill crowned by a white church. The hill was defended, surrounded by a trench halfway down. In this trench stood the soldiers side by side, down there in the earth, a great line of them. The night came on. Suddenly, on the other side, high up in the darkness, burst a beautiful greenish globe of light, and then came into being a magic circle of countryside set in darkness, a greenish jewel of landscape, splendid bulk of trees, a green meadow, vivid. The ball fell, and it was dark, and in one's eye remained treasured the little vision that had appeared far off in the darkness. Then again a light ball burst and sloped down. There was the white farmhouse, with the wooden slanting roof, the green apple trees, the orchard paling, a jewel, a landscape set deep in the darkness. It was beautiful beyond belief. Then it was dark. Then the searchlights suddenly sprang upon the countryside, revealing the magic, fingering everything with magic, pushing the darkness aside, showing the lovely hillsides, the sable bulks of trees, the pallor of corn. A searchlight was creeping at us. It slid up our hill. It was upon us. We turned our backs to it. It was unendurable. Then it was gone. Then out of a little wood at the foot of the hill came the intolerable crackling and bursting of rifles. The men in the trenches returned fire. Nothing could be seen. I thought of the bullets that would find their marks. But whose bullets? And what mark? Why must I fire off my gun in the darkness towards a noise? Why must a bullet come out of the darkness, breaking a hole in me? But better a bullet than the laceration of a shell, if it came to dying. But what is it all about? I cannot understand. I am not to understand. My God, why am I a man at all, when this is all, this machinery, piercing and tearing? It is a war of artillery, a war of machines, and men no more than the subjective material of the machine. It is so unnatural as to be unthinkable. Yet we must think of it. Saturday, November the 25th, 1916. The danger of infection from Germans. When the question was raised yesterday at the annual meeting in London of the Association of Poor Law Unions as to the source of venereal infections, it was stated that it was well known that Germans were very amenable to the disease by the looseness of their moral code. Germans had, it was argued, a high scientific process to deal with contagion. But, said the Reverend R.T. Tacon, they do not apply that in the channel which is the most important. I have 4 sons in the army, and I don't want them to be contaminated. I would rather that we could infect the German with good, healthy English blood. He added that the danger of foreign infection was not absent even now, because he knew of Germans employed at an hotel who had now conveniently become Swiss. The meeting decided that it would be no harm to have detention of infected cases, but that the natural disinclination of affected persons to declare their disease rendered the notification condition a negation of the good object in view. The discussion arose out of a letter from the Salford Board of Guardians, calling for the internment of all Germans as a source of infection. Approving the idea, the conference instructed the Executive Council to take all the necessary steps to give effect to this view. Wednesday, December the 19th, 1917. A reminder of the need for a Christmas fund. We have a visitor in Manchester. He is staying in Albert Square between the stone figures of John Bright and Bishop Fraser, and hopes to spend a profitable week in this city. The sight of that squat brown guest of ours cannot fail to bring thoughts of the whole family of tanks, which, far from being fated in an English town, are ploughing their way over the desolate fields of France. Our thoughts go out to the soldiers who are trudging after them. To many thousands of these men, the thought of this new recruit to warfare, settled comfortably on the flags of our square, will bring very vivid thoughts of home. They will remember the times they waited for cars in that very place, or put their watches right by the town hall clock. They will recollect at once that the bells used to play Robin Adair or the Minstrel Boy each day at 1 o'clock, and probably they will wonder if the symbol of conflict in those familiar surroundings is reminding us at home of the men to whom a tank means something more sinister than a sound bank. By our contributions this week, while our guest is with us and the fund for the Lancashire and Cheshire battalions at the front is still open, we can prove our thoughts for them. Contributors are asked carefully to note: all contributions, whether of articles or money, should be sent to the Manchester Guardian offices, 3 Cross Street, Manchester. Payment should be made by cheques or postal orders, which should be made payable to the Manchester Guardian Limited and crossed. The name and address of the sender and the character of the articles within should be marked on the outside of each parcel. The articles asked for: cigarettes, cigarette papers, tobacco, shag tobacco, pipes, clay and briar, tobacco pouches, pipe lighters, matches, candles, mufflers, socks, mittens, gloves, sleeveless sweaters, shirts, singlets, bootlaces, balaclava caps, bachelor's buttons, Macintosh capes, handkerchiefs, soap, shaving soap, safety razors, nail scissors, boot polish, black, toothbrushes, boot brushes, safety pins, anti-frostbite grease, insect powder, combination knife, fork and spoon, needles, sewing cotton, biscuits, chocolate, peppermints, tinned meats and fish, sweets, café au lait, writing pads, writing paper, envelopes, pencils, mouth organs, gramophones, gramophone records, indoor games, footballs, magazines and other reading matter, steel mirrors, toothpaste, pipe cleaners, and tinned milk. Wednesday, December the 29th, 1920. The Pity of War. C.P. Poems by Wilfred Owen. London, Chatto and Windus, 33 pages, 6 shillings net. Lieutenant Wilfred Owen, M.C., an officer of the Manchester Regiment, was killed in action on the Sambre Canal a week before the armistice, aged 25. The 23 poems of his collection are the fruit of not quite 2 years' active service, less than half of it in the field. But they are enough to rank him among the very few war poets whose work has more than a passing value. Others have shown the disenchantment of war, have unlegended the roselight and romance of it, but none with such compassion for the disenchanted, or such sternly just and justly stern judgment on the idolizers. To him the sight and sound of a man gassed suffice to give the lie to dulce et decorum and the rest of it. The atrophy that he damns is not that of the men who fought. Having seen all things red, the eyes are rid of the hurt of the colour of blood for ever. It is the atrophy of those who, quote, by choice, make themselves immune from whatever shares the eternal reciprocity of tears. If he glorifies the soldier, and he does gloriously, it is as victim, not as victor, not as the hero achieving, but as one whose sacrificial love passes the love of women. O love, your eyes lose lure, when I behold eyes blinded in my stead. Heart, you were never hot, nor large, nor full like hearts made great with shot. And though your hand be pale, paler are all which trail your cross through flame and hail. Weep, you may weep, for you may touch them not. His verse, as he says in his preface, is all of the pity of war. And, quote, except in the pity, end quote, there is no poetry. But it is a heroic exception, for the pity gets itself into poetry in phrases which are not the elegant chasing of ineffectual silver, but the vital, unbeautiful beauty of unwashed gold. It is the poetry of pain, searing and piercing to pity. It is the poetry of the tragic muse, whose visage, though, quote, marred more than any man, end quote, is yet transfigured in the sorrow of song. He has revealed the soul of the soldier as no one else has revealed it, not because his vision of the externals was less vivid and cleaving, but because to that vision he added an imagination of the heart that made him sure of his values. Except you share with them in hell the sorrowful dark of hell, whose world is but the trembling of a flare, and heaven but the highway for a shell. You shall not hear their mirth, you shall not come to think them well content by any jest of mind. These men are worth your tears, you are not worth their merriment. Irony his poetry has, and grim humour, but the spirit of the pities always breathes through the humour and the irony, and keeps their bitterness sweet. Sometimes, as in mental cases, the pain is too poignant even for pity, and moves only to the anger of despair, but more often the anger gives place to a beneficent impulse, as in Strange Meeting, the first and one of the finest of his poems. Then, when much blood had clogged their chariot wheels, I would go and wash them from sweet wells, even with truths that lie too deep for taint. This poem happens also to be a good example of technical innovation that is rather puzzling. Enough has been quoted to show that Owen uses traditional metres and rhymes, but as here, he also uses, and uses throughout the poem, a device which is neither rhyme nor assonance. It is not assonance because the vowels are different, and in any case it could not be rhyme because the initial consonants are alike: spoiled, spilled, laughed, left, grained, ground. It looks like a subtly contrived escape from tonal completeness, a calculated deflection from the kindred points of heaven and home which are rhymes, lest the musical significance should soften the conscious starkness of his treatment. But the result gain is more than doubtful. The thing affects you as the baffling elusiveness of a fugitive pun, or the half-foiled meeting of two stanzas of a sestina, and just because of the baffling and the foiling, it fails in its artistic purpose. It is significant that it is not used in his greatest poems, such as Apologia pro Poemati Mio and Greater Love, and one cannot help feeling that, fine as it is, Strange Meeting would have been finer without it. This trick apart, Owen uses words with the poet's questioning instinct for the heart of things, and his homing instinct for the heart of man. His work will not easily die. End of the First World War. Selections from the Manchester Guardian.
excerpt of The History of Simcoe County by Andrew F. Hunter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The History of Simcoe County by Andrew F. Hunter. Innisfil, Cherry Creek and its neighbourhood. Before 1830 a few families had taken up farms, and were already making their first clearings. To notice the more conspicuous, at least, of these settlers, and to review the most notable incidents of their first years in the forest, the plan proposed is to begin at the southern extremity of the township and proceed northward along the Penetanguishene road, making short digressions here and there into the various intersecting concessions, wherever a particular individual or event of notoriety should be recalled. Lewis J. Clement, a Dutch Canadian, arrived on North Half 16 Concession 1 from Niagara in June 1829 with his wife, one child, a hired man, and a yoke of oxen. He built a temporary brush tent, which was by them called home, for a brief period, until a more substantial and commodious dwelling place could be erected. Clement's house, built by the carpenter James Soles, was the first frame house in Innisfil, and is still standing. In subsequent years Mr. Clement became a magistrate. He died April 9, 1873, in his 74th year. A large family then survived him, of whom the best known, perhaps, were Dr. Lewis Clement of Bradford and Stephen Clement, who was for a time deputy sheriff of this county under Sheriff Smith, and who afterward became sheriff of Shoal Lake district at Birtle in Manitoba. Robert McLean, an Irish soldier, settled upon Lot 17, Concession 2, in May 1829, a month earlier than Clement. Dugald McLean, a son of this pioneer, and John Laurie, Jr., were the sawyers of the settlement, and they were drowned about 1840 off Degrassi Point. Both McLean and wife died from an attack during an epidemic of cholera, which carried off numerous settlers in that section in September 1849. Another notable pioneer, though not one of the earliest, was Charles Wilson, South Half 15 Concession 2, who arrived and settled in 1833. In company with the McConkie brothers of Lot 15 Concession 5, he came from the north of Ireland, Tyrone or Derry, and to a member of that family he became married. He was one of the 3 wardens of Innisfil for the year 1841, before a township council was organized, and filled other important positions at different times, but in 1850 he removed to Tecumseh. On a corner of his farm, Robert Laird, who had settled at an early date, opened a store about 1835, the first store in Innisfil. This was the nucleus of Cherry Creek. James Rogerson, North Half 19 Concession 2, a native of Scotland, arrived in 1833. Of his family, which was large, several members of it became residents of this neighbourhood. Alfred Wilson, the son of a U.E. Loyalist, came from Holland Landing after the rebellion and took up the north half, Lot 16 Concession 2 at Cherry Creek. He was the representative of Innisfil at the meetings of the Simcoe District Council from 1843 until 1849, both years inclusive. He also contested this county in December 1851 with the Honourable W.B. Robinson, but was not successful. Some time later he moved to Bellewart, where he lived until his death in 1888, at the age of 77 years. Hiram Wilson, his brother, with 2 sons, Lambert and Wellington, came from Sharon in York County, later, and purchased South Half Lot 16, Concession 3, near Cherry Creek, also becoming settlers of long standing. The Dalhousie settlers. Innisfil, like West Gwillimbury, had its Scottish settlement, but the group of settlers which it comprised came from another quarter, and at a later date, the autumn of 1832. We turn off the main road now to notice this group of interesting pioneers. Previous to that year they had settled in the township of Dalhousie, Lanark County, but finding its rocky surface anything but a congenial dwelling place, and seeing no prospects of making a permanent home there, they deserted in a body and settled in the southeast of Innisfil. Their native place was Glasgow and its vicinity, where some of them had belonged to the recalcitrant brotherhood of Glasgow weavers, so notorious in British history. They had left Scotland at the time of the intense public excitement preceding the passing of the Reform Bill. Most of them had taken part in the agitation, and, like the Pilgrim Fathers of an earlier time, they preferred to live beyond the sea rather than endure the grievances of their native land. Most of them, too, were platform orators and enthusiastic reformers, which their descendants are to this day. The individuals who lived with their families composed this interesting group of settlers were John Laurie, north half 17 concession 2, Rev. John Climie, south half 17 concession 2, John Todd, south half 19 concession 2, Hugh Todd, north half 12 concession 5, Gavin Allen, 15 concession 5, Robert Wallace, south half 22 concession 5, William Duncan, south half 18 concession 6, William Cross, 20 concession 6, James Jack, north half 21 concession 5. They settled closely together, and this circumstance, together with the fact that a number of their descendants remained at the old homesteads and in the same neighbourhood, gave the southeast part of Innisfil the Scotch Presbyterian character which it possessed. At the rebellion of 1837, some of these settlers did not desire to go to the front and assist in quelling the uprising, as they naturally sympathized to some extent with the principles advocated by William Lyon Mackenzie and his party. As the Dalhousie settlers were not outspoken in their opinions on the matter, they were suspected of having non-pacific intentions. One of them possessed an old rusty musket, which was promptly taken from him lest he should aid the rebels' cause, and he was forced by loyalists to go to the frontier. This circumstance attached the name of rebels in disguise to the Dalhousie people and their descendants for some years after the rebellion. Another report was circulated that they had been banished from Glasgow to Dalhousie, and that they had fled from their place of banishment to Innisfil. This report was chiefly made to do duty at municipal elections when any of the Dalhousie settlers were candidates. John Laurie, the first on the list given above, was a prominent person in his neighbourhood, and a platform speaker of ability. His two sons, John and William, together with Dugald Maclean, were the three sawyers of the settlement, for which they manufactured almost all the lumber for the district, with a whipshaw in one of the old-time saw-pits. About the year 1840, John Laurie Jr. and Maclean obtained a canoe near De Grassy Point, one Sunday afternoon, and set out to cross the lake to Roach's Point, on the opposite shore. They were never heard of afterwards, and it was supposed that they had been drowned off De Grassy Point. The other son, William Laurie, probably became better known at one day than any other member of the group. A few years after his arrival in Innisfil he married a daughter of Rev. John Climie, and filled a variety of callings. At one time he preached occasionally, at another he occupied the position of chief constable of this county, after having served a term in Bradford as bailiff of the division court, and another in Barrie in the office of Sheriff Smith. At other times he was bailiff, auctioneer, etc., and travelled throughout this county to a considerable extent in these capacities. Few men in his day knew it better than he. One of his most notable exploits was the arrest in 1858 of Robert Couture, the outlaw, charged with murder at Holland Landing. On another occasion he was in company with John Rose of Bradford, when they were beset by robbers near the place, but the two succeeded in warding off the attack. Subsequently he removed to Roxeter, Huron County, where he carried on a conveyancing business for some years, and reached an advanced age. Rev. John Climie, the second individual on the foregoing list, had been a weaver in a village 7 miles from Glasgow. A brother of his started the famous Clark Spool firm of Glasgow, the name of the firm continuing for several years to be Climie and Clark. His family consisted of 4 sons and some daughters, who came with him from Scotland. One of the sons died in Innisfil soon after their arrival. Rev. John Climie, Jr., of this family, was a Congregationalist minister, and was stationed from 1840 onward for some time at Bowmore, now Duntroon, in Ottawasaga, and subsequently at Darlington, 1851, Bowmanville, 1856, and Belleville, 1861. it appears to have been difficult for him to abstain from taking part in politics. His son, Mr. W. R. Climie, was secretary of the Ontario Press Association, and editor and proprietor of the Bowmanville Sun until his death in 1894. William Climie, another son of the pioneer, lived on the homestead on the second concession line. The two remaining brothers, George and Andrew, went to Perth County, and have left there a numerous line of descendants. Other settlers in the southeast. At Churchill, Galvin Allen, one of the Dalhousie settlers, took up lot 16, concession 3, north half, in 1832, and lived there for about 8 years, when he moved a mile further north. His sons have been identified with this neighbourhood from the beginning of the settlement. On the opposite corner of the crossroads, on south half, lot 15, concession 4, John Gimby, a native of England, settled with his family in 1833. 3 children of this family died during the local outbreaks of cholera in the autumn of 1849. This family removed to the township of Derby, near Owen Sound, where John and Joseph hewed out new homes for themselves in the unbroken forest. These 2 men in their neighbourhood became well known, the latter of whom died on November 21, 1889, at the age of 63, leaving a large family. In the early years of its existence, Churchill was known as Gimby's Corners, and subsequently as Bully's Acre, from the rough characters who often congregated there and held a merry Dublin. One of the best known citizens of Churchill for many years was Henry Sloane. By trade he was a wagon maker, and pursued his calling at this place. He was a prominent Orangeman, one of his ancestors having come with William of Orange from Holland and settled in Ireland. He was second deputy reeve of Innisfil for 2 years, 1869–70. In the neighbourhood of Lefroy, Henry Gross, who had arrived in the county in 1832, after some time spent in West Gwillimbury, settled on south half, lot 21, concession 4, Innisfil, and had a sawmill there at an early date. He was a native of England, became a justice of the peace, and was at one time a member of the township council. His death occurred in 1888. The village of Lefroy was named after General Sir John Henry Lefroy, who from 1844 until 1853 was in charge of the Magnetic Observatory in Toronto. General Lefroy's first wife was a daughter of Chief Justice Sir John Beverley Robinson. John Cripps, who arrived upon South Half 20, concession 4, about the same time as the other pioneers of this neighbourhood, at first performed all his farm work with only 1 ox. Then, after fortune had smiled more graciously upon him, with a horse and an ox yoked together, which presented a spectacle rather more amusing than convenient. Some years later he sold his farm, and shortly afterwards a false report was circulated by some one that gold had been found upon the farm which he had just left, causing him sorely to regret the sale of his possession. While in this neighbourhood, it may be proper to say a few words upon Bellewaerde, once the commercial metropolis of this Lake Simcoe region. For a long time, immediately after the opening of the Northern Railway in 1853, it was the busiest distributing point in the north, for there all the traffic of Lake Simcoe centred. It was the headquarters of the boats and the shipping of the lake. In 1852, Sage and Grant, 2 capitalists from the United States, built a large sawmill there, the largest in these parts at the time. While good timber was plentiful around the lake, a large business was carried on, but after a few years the timber limits became partially exhausted, the large mill was accidentally burned down, and Bellewaerde dwindled in size. With regard to the orthography of the word Bellewaerde, a curious circumstance arises. The place was named after the late Mr. Bell Ewart, spelt B-E-L-L, separate word E-W-A-R-T, and the word is so spelled in all records of the Post Office Department, but for some reason or other the most frequent rendering was Bellewaerde, spelt B-E-L-L-E, separate word E-W-A-R-T, and a majority of the older books and records persisted in using the final E. It is recorded, though with what degree of correctness we have been unable to learn, that a pioneer named Jacob Gill pitched his habitation in 1821 on lot 23, concession 2, near De Grasse Point, just in from the lake shore, where for a number of years he was left the sole disturber of the woodland peace. With Bellewaerde, the list of deserted villages is not exhausted, for about 3 miles to the north of that place, beyond Cedar Point, on the shore of a small bay, was once the village of Lakeland. Here was a sawmill and 2 or 3 dozen houses, but the place lost its human habitations. End of excerpt of the History of Simcoe County, recorded by Esther in Innisfil, Ontario, Canada.
Hundreds of lives lost. A waterspout's dreadful work in Pennsylvania. The city of Johnstown swept completely away. A lake on the neighboring hills bursts its barriers and sweeps everything before it. Men, women, and children swallowed up by the angry flood. Awful scenes witnessed by survivors. Pittsburgh, May 31st. An appalling catastrophe is reported from Johnstown, Cambria County, the meager details of which indicate that the city of 25,000 inhabitants has been practically wiped out of existence, and that hundreds, if not thousands of lives have been lost. A dam at the foot of a mountain lake 8 miles long and 3 miles wide, about 9 miles up the valley of the South Fork of the Conemaugh River, broke at 4 o'clock this afternoon, just as it was struck by a waterspout, and the whole tremendous volume of water swept in a resistless avalanche down the mountainside, making its own channel until it reached the South Fork of the Conemaugh, swelling it to the proportions of Niagara's rapids. The flood swept onward to the Conemaugh like a tidal wave, over 20 feet in height, to Johnstown, 6 or 8 miles below, gathering force as it tore along through the wider channel, and quickly swept everything before it. Houses, factories, and bridges were overwhelmed in the twinkling of an eye, and with their human occupants were carried in a vast chaos down the raging torrent. The water began flowing over the dam or abutment at the weakest part of the mountain lake at about 1 o'clock, when Johnstown and people down the valley were warned by messengers to look out for a flood as the result of a waterspout. 3 hours later the whole end of the lake gave way, sweeping everything before it, railroads, bridges, and telegraph lines included. The scene of the disaster is cut off entirely from all manner of communication, and has been since 6 o'clock this evening, and fragmentary details of the character and extent of the calamity have only come to hand from various places in the valley. About 6 o'clock, Superintendent Robert Pitcairn of the Pennsylvania Railroad telegraphed from Song Hollow, at the gap in the Laurel Ridge Mountains west of Johnstown, that he had seen about 200 persons afloat on gondola cars, shanties, etc., and that the disaster was appalling. One telegraph operator says he counted 63 bodies in 20 minutes floating past his office. A telegraph operator at Song Hollow, on the Pennsylvania Railroad tower, 12 miles this side of Jamestown, says that at least 75 dead bodies have floated past that point. The wires are all down, and no trains are running east of Blairsville, which is about 25 miles west of Johnstown. Pennsylvania Railroad officials aver that over 200 dead bodies have been counted floating downstream at Johnstown alone, while along the line many additional lives have been lost. But 2 houses in Johnstown are entirely above the line of the flood, and by far the greater part of the town has been entirely destroyed and carried down in the seething torrent. A special train bearing Pennsylvania Railroad officials and a large number of newspaper men has left this city for the scene. A special dispatch from Greensburg says, "A report has just reached here that the greater portion of Johnstown has been flooded and hundreds of lives lost. Houses are floating about, and the people who are free are panic-stricken and are fleeing to the mountains. At a point near New Florence, 85 persons have been seen floating down the river on driftwood. One report comes that but 2 roofs of houses in Johnstown can be seen. The Cove Town and the New Florence bridges have been washed away, and all the buildings along the Conemaugh between New Florence and Johnstown have been carried away. The railroad towers have been abandoned by the operators." A dispatch from Song Hollow says, "At 7:45 o'clock a boy was rescued by men in the signal tower of the railroad company. His name is unknown, but he said that with his father, mother, brother, and 2 sisters he was swept away in the light frame house which was their home. He was washed away from the building, but said the other members of the family were in it when it was swept over the breast of the new stone bridge at Johnstown, that it capsized a few seconds later, and that they were all drowned so far as he could tell." The railroad operator officially reports that before dark they were able to count 119 persons clinging to buildings, wreckage, or drowned and floating in the current.
If this information is to be credited, the damage in the town proper must be in the nature of a clean sweep. As early as 1 o'clock the alarm was sent to Johnstown that there was danger from the dam. The railroad officials were notified, and in a very short time began to carry people from the town to places of safety on regular trains and hastily improvised rescuing trains. Superintendent Pitcairn of the Western Division of the Pennsylvania Railroad was on his way to South Fork and was notified of impending trouble. Another report coming from Greensburg says, Johnstown is completely submerged and the loss of life is inestimable. Houses are going down the river by dozens, and people can be seen clinging to the roofs. At Caketown, a village of several hundred inhabitants, the houses are almost entirely covered, and a great many dwellings at Blairville are submerged. Scarcely a dwelling in the vicinity of Song Hollow can be seen. The bridges of Bolivar and Nineveh, it is reported, have given way, and that at Salzburg, it is feared, will be carried away. People here who have friends in the flooded district are eagerly waiting for news at the telegraph office. Great uneasiness prevails. The river at Livermore is rising, and great destruction will follow. Later dispatches indicate that the tempest is of far wider range than was at first indicated. It raged with terrible violence throughout Indiana, Cambria, Westmoreland, Blair, Huntingdon, Mifflin, Juniata, and Perry counties, carrying away the telegraph wires, flooding and washing out railroads, converting the beautiful mountain streams into raging and resistless torrents that carry death and devastation all along their paths. The Little Juniata, Frankstown branch, and Juniata rivers, that for the great part of the year are mere brooks, are over 30 feet deep with water. All the railroad and wagon bridges, so far as heard from, have been swept down in the watery avalanche, and countless houses that were never dreamed to be in danger from flood have been swept away. Philadelphia, May 31st. At the office of the General Manager of the Pennsylvania Railroad, it was stated tonight that all the wires of the company west of Wilmore, a station on the Pittsburgh Division, 25 miles west of Altoona, had been down since 8 a.m., and that consequently the information in regard to the break west of that place is very meager. Enough has been learned, however, to indicate that the rush of water is the worst ever known in that section. At Broad Street Station, the following bulletin for the information of travelers was posted about 8 o'clock. On account of the unprecedented storm prevailing in the western part of this state, the lines west of Altoona have been damaged to what extent cannot be ascertained until the water subsides. The storm is still raging, and it is thought no trains will be passed until Sunday. The Chicago Limited Express, which left New York at 9 o'clock this morning, the fast line leaving there at the same hour, and the train leaving that city at 8 o'clock last night, are all laid up at Altoona. At 10:30 tonight, a dispatch was received by General Manager Pugh, dated Wilmore, from the conductor of the eastbound New York and Chicago Limited, which left Pittsburgh at 7 o'clock this morning, saying the train was safe and that all were well on board. Mr. Pugh inferred from this that the Limited was laid up somewhere west of Lilly Station. The conductor reported that the bridge at South Fork was washed away, and expressed the opinion that all the bridges between South Fork and Johnstown would be swept away. The Chicago and New York Day Express and all other eastbound trains are supposed to be laid up between Cresson and Pittsburgh. When Mr. Pugh was shown a copy of the Associated Press dispatch from Pittsburgh announcing the breaking of the dam near Johnstown, he said the report confirmed a dispatch received from Wilmore tonight, which stated that a man had reported to the Pennsylvania Railroad operator there that the South Fork Dam had broken, and the water had carried away the coal tipple and telegraph tower at South Fork Station, and also a portion of an eastbound freight train. The telegraph operator who was in the tower managed to escape, but several of the train hands are reported to have been drowned. The reservoir or dam at South Fork, which is said to have burst with such terrible results, is described by a gentleman acquainted with the locality in which it was situated to be an immense body of water formerly used as a water supply for the old Pennsylvania Canal. It has been owned for several years by a number of Pittsburgh gentlemen who used it as a fishing ground. The gentleman who gave this information said that if the report of the bursting of the dam was true, he had no doubt that the damage and loss of life was fully as great as indicated by the dispatches. The conductor of the eastbound New York Limited Express, who reported the safety of his train, also said that a report had reached him of the breaking of the dam. He said nothing about the damage caused thereby. General Manager Pugh was out of town early in the day, and he said tonight that he could not understand what was meant when he received dispatches announcing damage to the tracks at Lilly Station. "Such a thing has never been heard of before," said he tonight, "and nothing short of a waterspout could have caused such damage. Lilies is a little mining town of about 300 or 400 inhabitants. For the water to rise high enough to obstruct the passage of trains is unprecedented. A dispatch just received by me says that the water is rushing over the tracks at a height of at least 5 feet above the roadbed, and this, I say, could be brought about by nothing short of a waterspout. I have no doubt if our operator at Song Hollow said he saw the bodies from Johnstown floating down the river, as reported in the Associated Press Bulletin, that it is true, as his tower is situated right on the bank of the river. A special dispatch from Altoona says, "Central Pennsylvania is in the midst of a flood tonight that has not been exceeded in the past 50 years. A steady, unbroken rain for 30 hours has paralyzed travel, destroyed numberless bridges, laid waste entire towns, and caused losses that will reach millions of dollars. The Juniata River is 30 feet high at Hollidaysburg, and the water is 4 feet deep in the streets of Gasport. All communication with southern county towns has been cut off since this morning. Not a bridge remains on the branch roads. Trains have been abandoned. The El Dorado Valley is a vast lake, and farming districts suffer untold destruction. The western division of the Pennsylvania Railroad is closed to travel. No trains from the west have passed this point since Thursday evening. Washouts have occurred at Portage and Lilly Station. Johnstown is partially submerged. There is a landslide at Wilmore and another at Allegrippa, on the mountain a mile long, and the Greensburg Bridge is gone. The limited express west is held here, and the railroad officials can give no encouragement when traffic can be resumed to the east. The bridge at Petersburg is very shaky. There are 2 miles of water at Tipton, through which trains run at heavy risk. Many families have been rescued from houses at Birmingham. Tyrone is cut off. Clearfield stands in 4 feet of water, and the Juniata at Huntingdon is a mile wide, sweeping destruction down the valley. The storm has caused $40,000 of damage in this city alone, and the great reservoirs are all but gone. The sewers are useless, many houses are undermined, and the storm shows no signs of cessation. 7 inches of rainfall in 30 hours has completely prostrated the Bell's Gap country, and that prosperous section from Bellwood to Puxatawney, 67 miles, is under the water ban. Word comes that Coalport is submerged by Clearfield Creek, and Blaine City is partially washed away. So far, no destruction of life is reported. John Caller was caught by the Juniata's rise at Frankstown. He had only time to climb a willow tree. He has been there since morning. Boats cannot reach him, and it is thought he has succumbed. 3 bridges are gone at Williamsburg, and the town is invested. End of article. This recording is in the public domain.
New Jersey Colored Men, from the New York Times, April 24th, 1872. Read for LibriVox.org by Alan Davis Drake. Long Branch, New Jersey, USA. New Jersey Colored Men. Colored Mass Meeting at Long Branch. Speeches and General Fete. Special Dispatch to the New York Times. Long Branch, August 23rd. A large and enthusiastic mass meeting of the Grant and Wilson colored citizens of Long Branch was held in this village tonight. This grand meeting was to have taken place Thursday night, but it was unfortunately prevented by the terrific storm which raged with such violence in the vicinity, and which completely frustrated the design of the Committee of Arrangements. The spot selected for the meeting was the large square between the Metropolitan and Clarendon hotels, fronting on the beach, which is well adapted to the purposes of a large open-air assemblage. The 9th Regiment used this square for encampment a year ago last summer. Owing to the duties of the colored population, many of whom work in hotels, restaurants, and private houses, it was impossible to organize at an early hour in the evening, and it was fully 10 o'clock before the forces began to muster. When they did, they came in from every quarter and in every way. Some came on horseback, some in carriages, others traveling a long distance on foot. But everybody of color appeared eager to turn out and unite in the grand demonstration in support of the administration, and in honor and favor of President Grant. The hotels, as far as the waiters were concerned, were nearly destitute, and the general exodus of the colored population had the effect of drawing a very large number of other guests to the square to listen to the remarks of the speakers and become partakers in the general enthusiasm. The original program was to have all of the waiters of the different hotels form in line and march to the president's cottage, serenade him there, being headed by the band, proceed to march in procession past all of the hotels to the square in front of the Metropolitan Hotel, where the stand had been erected for the speakers. The Excelsior Cornet Band, composed entirely of colored men from Philadelphia, was here on Thursday to lead the procession and join in celebrating the occasion, but could not remain to the postponed meeting in the consequence of a previous engagement to be in Cape May on the 23rd of September. The waiters of the Metropolitan Hotel, a very large body, marched to the West End Hotel, where they were joined by their brethren of that house, as well as by the waiters of the Howland's Hotel, Jawkes Hotel, Clarendon Hotel, United States Hotel, Ocean Hotel, and Mansion House. Their numbers were largely augmented by people who came in from the surrounding country, in sympathy with the movement. Large numbers of torches were borne in the procession, as well as Chinese lanterns and transparencies with mottos, "Let us have peace," "One good term deserves another," "We are for the right man, Grant, 1873." Roman candles and fireworks of every description were in abundance, and the continuous glare of blue lights, shooting off Roman candles and other brilliant passage of rockets through the air, rendered the scene both animated and delightful. The committee found it impossible to procure a band, as those at Long Branch are permanently employed by the hotels. A telegram to Red Bank for a band met with no success, and the procession was compelled to march without music. After marching to the stand, the meeting was organized by the election of Mr. A. J. Davis as president and Mr. Robert Taylor of Washington and 12 others as vice presidents. The chairman made a short speech strongly supporting the administration and endorsing the action of President Grant, after which he introduced Mr. Richard Garnett of Baltimore. Mr. Garnett spoke in a logical and convincing way concerning the relative position of President Grant and Horace Greeley, the Democratic nominee, before the people, and of the services which each has rendered to the colored race. He showed that while President Grant had done more to elevate and place the colored race in positions due to them as men and kept him there, Greeley has been undecided and willing, for the mere sake of office, to let all the good which has been done already be wiped out. He also spoke of the attitude of W. U. Garnett, and characterized him as a man simply chasing after power, and willing, like Greeley, to do almost anything to obtain it. Mr. H. B. Wilson of Long Branch was next introduced to the audience, and said, although he was suffering from hoarseness, he could not but speak a word for the cause which so heartily commended itself to every honest and patriotic American citizen. He spoke very strongly in favor of the Republican party. Mr. Titus of New York followed in an outing and able address. General Hooker of New York also spoke strongly in favor of the administration. The meeting was largely attended, and great enthusiasm was manifested. Tumultuous cheering at times interrupted the remarks of the speakers. End of New Jersey Colored Men, from the New York Times. This recording is in the public domain.
Origin of the Shell Mounds by J. Y. Detweiler, Florida Fish Commissioner. From the Florida Historical Society Quarterly, April 1908. Read for LibriVox.org by Leanne Howlett, in Florida. Modern methods of traveling and the corresponding number of travelers permitting easy access to all parts of the civilized world, and especially throughout the United States, cause many persons to spend their winters in a semi-tropical climate, thereby combining the opportunity to escape the rigor of winter and secure that change of climate conducive to health and happiness. To entertain this vast concourse of people, whose dispositions and tastes vary almost as much as their personal appearance, is no small matter. For the success of each city or locality in obtaining its proportion of tourists is in proportion to their being properly and satisfactorily entertained. Time, unless satisfactorily occupied by the individual, hangs heavily on his hands, and a change is made for the better the first available opportunity. The first questions arising in regard to a given locality are its accessibility, its living accommodations, and its opportunities for enjoyment. Hunting, fishing, and sightseeing are among the principal time-killing occupations, and the locality that can combine the three mentioned requisites is favored in proportion as these opportunities are known. Perhaps no location in the state of Florida possesses better opportunities in these three directions than New Smyrna for the class of people whose means permit them to retire from business for a time, leaving their home duties for a period of rest, recuperation, and enjoyment, at a price within their income. Hunting has its advantages among the sterner sex. Fishing is enjoyed by the majority of ladies, some of whom are enthusiasts on the subject, but sightseeing, especially that which abounds within the realms of nature, is enjoyed by all classes. New Smyrna possesses in a very great measure all and more than that of any other place. The heavy hammocks within her environments, portions of which are under cultivation and embrace the largest orange groves in the state, her prehistoric buildings, dating beyond the memory of man, without sufficient historic data to inform the present generation as to their antecedents, comprising the foundations of a prehistoric fort, a building from every indication a Spanish mission, and other historical objects. In addition to this, we have the prehistoric shell mounds located at different points along the river, showing conclusively that races of men subsisted upon the oysters, the shells of which remain, for countless ages. These shell mounds, in some instances, are of such magnitude as to cover several acres, and in places are 40 feet high. Along the west banks of the North Indian River the shell ridges extend for a distance of many miles. They are also found along the Halifax River from Ormond to New Smyrna, but more especially observed along the new automobile road connecting the later city with Daytona. These shell piles are of such magnitude that an intelligent person said to the writer, "What an upheaval of nature's forces must have occurred to produce this vast pile of shells," little realizing that they were the kitchen middens, or the refuse of the culinary department of forgotten races of men, which, having withstood the ravages of time, excite the wonder and curiosity of succeeding generations. It is mainly the object of this article to correct the misleading ideas possessed by the public on this matter, and to explain satisfactorily and intelligently how these shell piles were formed by those who erected them. Centuries ago, the waterways of the east coast of Florida were virtually of the same character as today, a system of lagoons, forming century after century, the ridges dividing the fresh water from the ocean at intervals, an inlet permitting the fresh water to enter the ocean. The St. Johns River at one time was what the Halifax and Indian rivers are today. At DeLand, an examination of the shell banks or marl pits shows decomposed shells, an occasional clamshell or conch shell entire. At Enterprise there are large shell mounds of fresh water shells, collected for the purpose of food by those living at that time. They are a species of snail, and their shells are entire. The method by which the edible matter was removed will be explained later. The present marshes in the vicinity of New Smyrna were at one time a vast oyster bed, covered daily by the ebb and flow of the tide. The topography of the surrounding country was the same as now, no fresh-water streams other than creeks emptying into the lagoons, the density of the water was too great for deep-water cultivation of oysters, and the limit of the fixation of the oyster spat was that of extreme high or low water or the spring and neap tides. The marsh was composed of soft mud, and the oyster beds, when once formed, covered vast areas, and were the sources from which the oysters were collected that produced the mounds. An examination of the shell in the mounds today shows they were entirely similar to those in the marshes at the present time as collected for an oyster roast by the tourists. These are culled, the larger ones broken off, the smaller ones remaining to increase in size. The point of juncture is easily discerned. The length of the oyster shows that it was restricted in lateral growth by being bunched with others to elevate itself out of the mud. An oyster grown on a hard bottom lying on the side having depth and width made like a saucer. The calcareous matter of the shell was thin, showing but little lime in the water. The edges of the shell are invariably found unbroken, showing that they were not struck with an implement in order to obtain the edible matter inside. How was this accomplished in a speedy and satisfactory manner? Pots, pans, and kettles were not then in use, or the question could be readily solved. It is supposed game was plentiful, and the skin of a deer would make satisfactory receptacle for hot water to open the oyster by immersion therein. How to heat the water with no stones to heat in the fire but coquina, which would burn into lime. Necessity knows no law, and by building up an earthenware pot from the marsh clay the mystery is readily solved. A hole was dug in the sand, lined with a deer skin. This was filled with water. The earthenware pot was placed therein, a fire built inside which soon boiled the water. Oysters were placed around the pot, or dipped in until the shell opened, and they were pried open with another shell, and the oyster was ready for eating. In the case of the Donac or soup clam, the conditions were reversed. The clams were boiled, the broth made use of with fish, game, and other food. Pieces of broken pottery are plentifully found among the shell piles, as well as large conchs with the point broken to obtain the contents. In the case of the fresh water snails along the St. John's River, the dipping in the hot water would loosen the animal, leaving the shell intact. As to the method of making fire, it was presumably obtained by friction in some manner, and in their travels by canoe or overland could be kept in the cooking pot. All the pieces that are found are black on the inside. In the investigation of the conditions that then existed, there is as much enjoyment and satisfaction secured by the lover of nature in his search for information as in other pursuits, and if the mystery of how the shell mounds were formed is satisfactorily made plain, it is but a contribution to knowledge freely imparted to those who have not had the opportunity to investigate for themselves. End of Origin of the Shell Mounds. This recording is in the public domain.
Reminiscences of Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Robert Southey by Joseph Cottle. Read for LibriVox.org by Rachel Lintern, Bristol, UK. To account for my introduction to all the persons subsequently noticed, it is necessary to apprise the reader that I was a bookseller in Bristol from the year 1791 to 1798, from the age of 21 to 28, and having imbibed from my tutor and friend, the late John Henderson, one of the most extraordinary of men, some little taste for literature, I found myself during that period generally surrounded by men of cultivated minds. With these preliminary remarks I shall commence the narrative. At the close of the year 1794, a clever young man of the Society of Friends, of the name of Robert Lovell, who had married a Miss Fricker, informed me that a few friends of his from Oxford and Cambridge, with himself, were about to sail to America, and, on the banks of the Susquehanna, to form a social colony, in which there was to be a community of property, and where all that was selfish was to be proscribed. None, he said, were to be admitted into their number but tried and incorruptible characters, and he felt quite assured that he and his friends would be able to realize a state of society free from the evils and turmoils that then agitated the world, and to present an example of the eminence to which men might arrive under the unrestrained influence of sound principles. He now paid me the compliment of saying that he would be happy to include me in this select assemblage, who, under a state which he called pantisocracy, were, he hoped, to regenerate the whole complexion of society, and that not by establishing formal laws, but by excluding all the little deteriorating passions, injustice, wrath, anger, clamour, and evil speaking, and thereby setting an example of human perfectibility. Young as I was, I suspected there was an old and intractable leaven in human nature that would effectually frustrate these airy schemes of happiness, which had been projected in every age and always with the same result. At first the disclosure so confounded my understanding that I almost fancied myself transported to some new state of things, while images of patriarchal and pristine felicity stood thick around, decked in the rainbow's colours. A moment's reflection, however, dissolved the insubstantial vision, when I asked him a few plain questions. "How do you go?" said I. My young and ardent friend instantly replied, "We freight a ship, carrying out with us ploughs and other implements of husbandry." The thought occurred to me that it might be more economical to purchase such articles in America, but not too much to discourage the enthusiastic aspirant after happiness. I forbore all reference to the accumulation of difficulties to be surmounted, and merely inquired who were to compose his company. He said that only 4 had as yet absolutely engaged in the enterprise: Samuel Taylor Coleridge from Cambridge, in whom I understood the plan to have originated; Robert Southey, and George Burnet from Oxford, and himself. "Well," I replied, "when do you set sail?" He answered, "Very shortly. I soon expect my friends from the universities, when all the preliminaries will be adjusted, and we shall joyfully cross the blue waves of the Atlantic." "But," said I, "to freight a ship, and sail out in the high style of gentlemen agriculturists, will require funds. How do you manage this?" "We all contribute what we can," said he, "and I shall introduce all my dear friends to you immediately on their arrival in Bristol." Robert Lovell, though inexperienced and constitutionally sanguine, was a good specimen of the open frankness which characterises the well-informed members of the Society of Friends, and he excited in me an additional interest from a warmth of feeling and an extent of reading above even the ordinary standard of the estimable class to which he belonged. He now read me some of the MS. poems of his 2 unknown friends, which at once established their genius in my estimation. My leisure having been devoted for many years to reading and composition, and having a small volume of poems at that time in the press, I anticipated great pleasure from an introduction to 2 poets who superadded to talents of a higher order all the advantages arising from learning, and a consequent familiarity with the best models of antiquity; independently of which they excited an interest, and awakened a peculiar solicitude, from their being about so soon to leave their fatherland, and to depart permanently for a foreign shore. One morning shortly after, Robert Lovell called on me, and introduced Robert Southey. Never will the impression be effaced produced on me by this young man: tall, dignified, possessing great suavity of manners, an eye piercing, with a countenance full of genius, kindliness, and intelligence. I gave him at once the right hand of fellowship, and to the moment of his decease that cordiality was never withdrawn. I had read so much of poetry, and sympathized so much with poets in all their eccentricities and vicissitudes, to see before me the realization of a character which in the abstract most absorbed my regards, gave me a degree of satisfaction which it would be difficult to express. I must now make a brief reference to George Burnet, who in this epidemic delusion had given his sanction to, and embarked all his prospects in life on this Pantisocrator scheme. He was a young man about the age of 20, the son of a respectable Somersetshire farmer, who had bestowed on him his portion by giving him a university education as an introduction to the church, into which he would probably have entered but for this his transatlantic pursuit of happiness. His talents were not conspicuous, but his manners were unpresuming, and honesty was depicted on his countenance. He possessed also that habitual good temper and those accommodating manners which would prove a desirable accession in any society, and it soon appeared, without indicating any disrespect, that his was a subordinate part to act in the new drama, and not the less valuable for its wanting splendour. After some considerable delay, it was at length announced that on the coming morning Samuel Taylor Coleridge would arrive in Bristol, as the nearest and most convenient port, and where he was to reside but a short time before the favouring gales were to waft him and his friends across the Atlantic. Robert Lovell at length introduced Mr. C. I instantly descried his intellectual character, exhibiting as he did an eye, a brow, and a forehead indicative of commanding genius. Interviews succeeded, and these increased the impression of respect. Each of my new friends read me his productions. Each accepted my invitations and gave me those repeated proofs of good opinion, ripening fast into esteem, that I could not be insensible to the kindness of their manners, which, it may truly be affirmed, infused into my heart a brotherly feeling that more than identified their interests with my own. I introduced them to several intelligent friends, and their own merits soon augmented the number, so that their acquaintance became progressively extended, and their society coveted. Bristol was now found a very pleasant residence, and though the ship was not engaged, nor the least preparation made for so long a voyage, still the delights and wide-spreading advantages of Pantisocracy formed one of their everlasting themes of conversation. And considering the barrenness of the subject, it was in no common degree amusing to hear these young enthusiasts repel every objection to the practicality of their scheme, and magnify the condition to which it was to introduce them, where thorns and briars were no doubt to be expelled, and their couch to be strewed with down and roses. It will excite merely an innocent smile in the reader at the extravagance of a youthful and ardent mind, when he learns that Robert Lovell stated with great seriousness, that after the minutest calculations and inquiry among practical men, the demand on their labour would not exceed 2 hours a day, that is, for the production of absolute necessaries. The leisure still remaining might be devoted in convenient fractions to the extension of their domain, by prostrating the sturdy trees of the forest, where lop and top without cost would supply their cheerful winter fire, and the trunks, when cut into planks without any other expense than their own pleasant labour, would form the sties for their pigs, and the linneys for their cattle, and the barns for their produce, reserving their choicest timbers for their own comfortable log dwellings. But after every claim that might be made on their manual labour had been discharged, a large portion of time would still remain for their own individual pursuits, so that they might read, converse, and even write books. Cooper, in an unpublished letter now before me, says, I know well that publication is necessary to give an edge to the poetic turn, and that what we produce in the closet is never a vigorous birth, if we intend that it should die there. For my own part, I could no more amuse myself with writing verse, if I did not print it when written, than with the study of tactics, for which I can never have any real occasion. But our young and ardent friend seemed to entertain a strong impression that the mere pleasure of writing, that is, like virtue, writing for its own sake, was all the mental and rational gratification wise men could desire. Views and times alter, and these richly endowed young men in after life were prompt, and among the first to confess the fallacious schemes of their youth. But at this time the pleasurable alone occupied their field of vision, and confidence never stood more unencumbered with doubt. If any difficulties were now started, and many such there were, a profusion of words demonstrated the reasonableness of the whole design, impressing all who heard with the conviction that the citadel was too strong for assault. The Mercury at this time was generally Mr. Coleridge, who, as has been stated, ingeniously parried every adverse argument, and after silencing his hardy disputants, announced to them that he was about to write and publish a quarto volume in defence of Pantisocracy, in which a variety of arguments would be advanced in defence of his system, too subtle and recondite to comport with conversation. It would then, he said, become manifest that he was not a projector raw from his cloister, but a cool calculating reasoner, whose efforts and example would secure to him and his friends the permanent gratitude of mankind. From the sentiments thus entertained I shall represent Mr. Coleridge in the section of his days which devolves on me to exhibit, just as he was, and that with a firm belief that by so doing, without injuring his legitimate reputation, I shall confer an essential benefit on those to come, who will behold in Mr. C. much to admire and imitate, and certainly some things to regret. For it should be remembered, Mr. Coleridge, from universal admission, possessed some of the highest mental endowments, and many pertaining to the heart. But if a man's life be valuable, not for the incense it consumes, but for the instruction it affords, to state even defects, in one like Mr. C., who can so well afford deduction without serious loss, becomes in his biographer not optional, but a serious obligation. It is proper additionally to remark that some apology or propitiation may be necessary toward those who regard every approximation to poverty not as a misfortune but a crime. Pecuniary difficulties, especially such as occur in early life, and not ascribable to bad conduct, reflect no discredit on men of genius. Many of them subsequently surmounted their first embarrassments by meritorious exertion, and some of our first men, like travellers after having successfully passed through regions of privation and peril, delight even to recall their former discouragements, and without the shame that luxuriates alone in little minds, undisguisedly to tell of seasons indelible in their memories, when, in the prostration of hope, the wide world appeared one desolate waste. But they ultimately found that these seasons of darkness, however tenaciously retained by memory, in better times often administered a new and refreshing zest to present enjoyment. Despair therefore ill becomes one who has follies to bewail, and a God to trust in. Johnson and Goldsmith, with numerous others, at some seasons were plunged deep in the waters of adversity, but halcyon days awaited them, and even those sons of merit and misfortune, whose pecuniary troubles were more permanent, in the dimness of retrospection only stand out invested in softer hues. Cervantes is not the less read because the acclamations of praise were heard by him in his abode of penury. Butler, Otway, Collins, Chatterton, and Burns, and men like them, instead of suffering in public estimation from the difficulties they encountered, absolutely challenge in every generous mind an excess of interest from the very circumstances that darkened the complexion of their earthly prospects. In corroboration of this remark, in our own day, the son of Crabbe, who must have cherished the deepest solicitudes for his father's reputation, has laid bare to general inspection his parents' early perplexities, by which impartial disclosures we behold the individual in his deepest depressions, worth enriched by trial, and greatness by a refining process, struggling successfully with adversity. Does the example of such a man, nobly bearing up against the pressures that surrounded him, inflict obduracy in our hearts? On the contrary, while we feelingly sympathize with the poet, and deplore the tardy hand of deliverance, we pause only to transfer a reflex portion of praise to him whose magnanimous conduct has furnished so ample a scope for the tenderest emotions of our nature. This reflection will induce me not to withhold from false delicacy occurrences, the disclosure of which none but the inconsiderate will condemn, and by which all the features of Mr. Coleridge's character will be exhibited to the inspection of the inquisitive and philosophical mind. I proceed therefore to state that the solicitude I felt lest these young and ardent geniuses should in a disastrous hour, and in their mistaken apprehensions, commit themselves in this their desperate undertaking, was happily dissipated by Mr. Coleridge applying for the loan of a little cash. To pay the voyager's freight, or passage? No, lodgings. They all lodged at this time at number 48 College Street. Never did I lend money with such unmingled pleasure, for now I ceased to be haunted day and night with the spectre of the ship which was to effect such incalculable mischief. The form of the request was the following: "My dear Sir, can you conveniently lend me £5, as we want a little more than £4 to make up our lodging bill, which is indeed much higher than we expected. 7 weeks, and Burnett's lodging for 12 weeks, amounting to £11. Yours affectionately, S. T. Coleridge." Till this time, not knowing what the resources of my young friends were, I could not wholly divest myself of fear, but now an effectual barrier manifestly interposed to save them from destruction; and though their romantic plan might linger in their minds, it was impossible not to be assured that their strong good sense would eventually dissipate their delusions. Finding now that there was a deficiency in that material deemed of the first consequence in all civilized states, and remembering Burke's feeling lamentation over the improvidence, or rather the indifference, with which many men of genius regard the low thoughts that are merely of a pecuniary nature, I began to revolve on the means by which the two poets might advantageously apply their talents. Soon after, finding Mr. Coleridge in rather a desponding mood, I urged him to keep up his spirits, and recommended him to publish a volume of his poems. "Oh," he replied, "that is a useless expedient." He continued, "I offered a volume of my poems to different booksellers in London, who would not even look at them; the reply being, 'Sir, the article will not do.' At length one, more accommodating than the rest, condescended to receive my manuscript poems, and after a deliberate inspection offered me for the copyright 6 guineas, which sum, poor as I was, I refused to accept. 'Well,' said I, 'to encourage you I will give you 20 guineas.' It was very pleasant to observe the joy that instantly diffused itself over his countenance. 'Nay,' I continued, 'others publish for themselves. I will chiefly remember you. Instead of giving you 20 guineas, I will extend it to 30, and without waiting for the completion of the work, to make you easy, you may have the money as your occasions require.' The silence and the grasped hand showed that at that moment one person was happy. End of extract. This recording is in the public domain.
Secessionists Being Armed by Messrs. Walker and Lick. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. I have been surprised to see the way Union men have been served during this rebellion. Men in the southern part of our state, in Dent County, Texas County, and over the southern and southeastern part of Phelps, practically are hired to be secessionists and secession sympathizers. Union men who have been known and tried as such are held in terror of their lives by the secession sympathizers in their neighborhoods. Their property is taken from them with perfect impunity. Union citizens are taught, practically, that they cannot receive any protection for life or property from the secession guerrillas and their active cooperators, secession sympathizers. Secessionists take an oath for which they openly say they have no respect, give a bond which stands in no danger of being forfeited because never enforced. Their sons return from the rebel army and bring their arms with them, which they are not required to give up. Their secession neighbors, with very few exceptions, withheld their guns at the call under General Order No. 19, while the Union citizens delivered their guns up. The consequence is secessionists are armed, the Union citizens are unarmed. Another thing, the Union citizens experience as much difficulty in getting their arms as secessionists do from our present authorities. Consequently, every advantage is given to those of secession proclivities to annoy and harass Union citizens. If a Union man loses or has lost any property from secessionists, he has practically little or no redress, whereas if a secessionist, he has just as good a claim upon government for protection as though he were loyal. Go into any of those neighborhoods. Who are the unarmed citizens? Union men. Who are robbed? Union men. Who are despised? Union men. Whose families are robbed of their subsistence? Union soldiers. Whose lives are in danger in those infernal neighborhoods? Union citizens. What families really suffer the most from military restrictions upon trade? I think I say not too much when I say that Union citizens experience more trouble in proving their loyalty than secessionists themselves. I make no charges or reflections upon any officers in the discharge of their duties, but I do say these appear to be the facts, and I would respectfully ask if it should be so. Is it right that returned rebels who are here to hibernate, only to return to their robbing and stealing in the spring, should receive better protection than loyal citizens? And does it appear right that forsooth, because a man has returned from the rebel army and given a bond, that it should entitle him to better protection than a citizen who has always remained true to his country? If so, then is the effect of it to offer a premium to traitors. A neighborhood where a Union man cannot live in safety is not entitled to the protection of government. Neighborhoods that do not respect their oaths enough to yield to Union citizens the same protection they claim for themselves should not receive the respect or protection of government officials, but should be treated as rebel communities. Union. End of Secessionists Being Armed by Messrs. Walker and Lick. Recording by Eric Ray in Missouri, United States.
Silences by DeBose Hayward. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. From Carolina Chansons by Hervey Allen and DeBose Hayward. Silences, followed by Note on the Chimes by DeBose Hayward. You who have known my city for a day and heard the music of her steepled bells, then laughed and passed along your vagrant way, carrying only what the city tells to those who listen solely with their ears. You know St. Matthew's swinging harmonies and old St. Michael's tale of golden years, far less like bells than chanted memories. Yet there is something wanting in the song of lyric youth with voice unschooled by pain, and there are breathing stillnesses that throng dim corners and that only stir again when bells are dumb. Not even bronze that beats our heart-throbs back can tell of old defeats. But you who take the city for your own, come with me when the night flows deep and kind, along these narrow ways of troubled stone, and floods the wide savannas of the mind with tides that cool the fever of the day. One with the dark, companioned by the stars, we'll seek St. Philip's, nebulous and gray, holding its throbbing beacon to the bars, a prisoned spirit vibrant in the stone that knew its empire of forgotten things. Then will the city know you for her own, and feel you meet to share her sufferings, while down a swirl of poignant memories, herself shall find you in her silences. Once coaches waited row on shining row before this door, and where the thirsty street drank the deep shadow of the portico, the Sunday hush was stirred by happy feet, low greetings, and the rustle of brocade. The organ throb and warmth of sunny eyes that flashed and smiled beneath a bonnet shade, life with the lure of all its swift disguise. Then from the soaring lyric of the spire, like the composite voice of all the town, the bells burst swiftly into singing fire that wrapped the building and which showered down bright cadences to flash along the ways, loud with the splendid gladness of the days. War took the city, and the laughter died from lips that pain had kissed. One after one all lovely things went down the sanguine tide, while death made moaning answer to the gun. Then, as a golden voice dies in the throat of one who lives, but whose glad heart is dead, the bells were taken, and a sterner note rang from their bronze where Lee and Jackson led. The rhythmic seasons chill and burn and chill, cooling old angers, warming hearts again. The ancient building quickens to the thrill of lilting feet, but only singing rain flutters old echoes in the portico. Those who can still remember love it so. End of Silences by DeBose Hayward. Note on the chimes, to accompany Silences. The bells of Charleston, like the bells of London town, have a peculiar interest. St. Michael's bells and clock were brought from England in 1764. When the British evacuated Charleston in 1782, they took the bells with them. A Mr. Renault bought them in England and returned them. They were rehung in November 1783. During the Civil War, St. Michael's steeple was the target for Federal artillery and fleet guns. In 1861 the bells were taken to Columbia, South Carolina, where 2 of them were stolen, and the rest injured by fire when the city was burned. Those left were again sent to England and recast in the original molds. In March 1867 they once again rang out from the spire. St. Philip's Church stands in the old part of the town. During the Civil War its bells were cast into cannon. For a long time its steeple was used as a lighthouse. It is the center of forgotten things. The bells of St. Matthew's are modern and speak of a new order. But all the bells are the voice of the town. They speak for her silences, which are eloquent. End of Note on the Chimes. Recording by Laurie Ann Walden, from South Carolina, now living in North Carolina.
The Two Sisters by Pauline Johnson. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Two Sisters, The Lions. From Legends of Vancouver by E. Pauline Johnson. You can see them as you look towards the north and the west, where the dream hills swim into the sky amid their ever-drifting clouds of pearl and gray. They catch the earliest hint of sunrise. They hold the last color of sunset. Twin mountains they are, lifting their twin peaks above the fairest city in all Canada, and known throughout the British Empire as the Lions of Vancouver. Sometimes the smoke of forest fires blurs them until they gleam like opals in a purple atmosphere, too beautiful for words to paint. Sometimes the slanting rains festoon scarves of mist about their crests, and the peaks fade into shadowy outlines, melting, forever melting into the distances. But for most days in the year the sun circles the twin glories with a sweep of gold. The moon washes them with a torrent of silver. Oftentimes, when the city is shrouded in rain, the sun yellows their snows to a deep orange. But through sun and shadow they stand immovable, smiling westward above the waters of the restless Pacific, eastward above the superb beauty of the Capilano Canyon. But the Indian tribes do not know these peaks as the Lions. Even the chief, whose feet have so recently wandered to the happy hunting grounds, never heard the name given them until I mentioned it to him one dreamy August day, as together we followed the trail leading to the canyon. He seemed so surprised at the name that I mentioned the reason that it had been applied to them, asking him if he recalled the Landseer lions in Trafalgar Square. Yes, he remembered those splendid sculptures, and his quick eye saw the resemblance instantly. It appeared to please him, and his fine face expressed the haunting memories of the far-away roar of old London. But the call of the blood was stronger, and presently he referred to the Indian legend of those peaks, a legend that I have reason to believe is absolutely unknown to thousands of pale-faces who look upon the lions daily, without the love for them that is in the Indian heart, without knowledge of the secret of the two sisters. The legend was intensely fascinating as it left his lips in the quaint broken English that is never so dulcet as when it slips from an Indian tongue. His inimitable gestures, strong, graceful, comprehensive, were like a perfectly chosen frame embracing a delicate painting, and his brooding eyes were as the light in which the picture hung. "Many thousands of years ago," he began, "there were no twin peaks like sentinels guarding the outposts of this sunset coast. They were placed there long after the first creation, when the Sagali Tyee molded the mountains, and patterned the mighty rivers where the salmon run, because of his love for his Indian children, and his wisdom for their necessities. In those times there were many and mighty Indian tribes along the Pacific, in the mountain ranges, at the shores and sources of the great Fraser River. Indian law ruled the land. Indian customs prevailed. Indian beliefs were regarded. Those were the legend-making ages when great things occurred to make the traditions we repeat to our children today. Perhaps the greatest of these traditions is the story of the two sisters. They are known to us as the chief's daughters, and to them we owe the great peace in which we live, and have lived for many countless moons. There is an ancient custom amongst the coast tribes that, when our daughters step from childhood into the great world of womanhood, the occasion must be made one of extreme rejoicing. The being who possesses the possibility of some day mothering a man-child, a warrior, a brave, receives much consideration in most nations, but to us, the Sunset Tribes, she is honored above all people. The parents usually give a great potlatch, and a feast that lasts many days. The entire tribe and the surrounding tribes are bidden to this festival. More than that, sometimes when a great Tyee celebrates for his daughter, the tribes from far up the coast, from the distant north, from inland, from the island, from the Caribou country, are gathered as guests to the feast. During these days of rejoicing the girl is placed in a high seat, an exalted position, for is she not marriageable? And does not marriage mean motherhood? And does not motherhood mean a vaster nation of brave sons and gentle daughters, who in their turn will give us sons and daughters of their own? But it was many thousands of years ago that a great Tyee had two daughters that grew to womanhood at the same springtime, when the first great run of salmon thronged the rivers, and the olali bushes were heavy with blossoms. These two daughters were young, lovable, and oh, very beautiful. Their father, the great Tyee, prepared to make a feast such as the coast had never seen. There were to be days and days of rejoicing. The people were to come for many leagues, were to bring gifts to the girls, and to receive gifts of great value from the chief. And hospitality was to reign as long as pleasuring feet could dance, and enjoying lips could laugh, and mouths partake of the excellence of the chief's fish, game, and olalis. The only shadow on the joy of it all was war, for the tribe of the great Tyee was at war with the upper coast Indians, those who lived north, near what is named by the paleface as the port of Prince Rupert. Giant war canoes slipped along the entire coast, War parties paddled up and down. War songs broke the silences of the nights. Hatred, vengeance, strife, horror festered everywhere like sores on the surface of the earth. But the great Tyee, after warring for weeks, turned and laughed at the battle and the bloodshed, for he had been victor in every encounter, and he could well afford to leave the strife for a brief week and feast in his daughter's honour, nor permit any mere enemy to come between him and the traditions of his race and household. So he turned insultingly deaf ears to their war cries. He ignored with arrogant indifference their paddle dips that encroached within his own coast waters. And he prepared, as a great Tyee should, to royally entertain his tribesmen in honour of his daughters. But 7 suns before the great feast, these 2 maidens came to him, hand clasped in hand. "O our father," they said, "may we speak?" "Speak, my daughters, my girls with the eyes of April, the hearts of June." Early spring and early summer would be the more accurate Indian phrasing. "Some day, O our father, we may mother a man-child, who may grow to be just such a powerful Tyee as you are. And for this honour that may some day be ours, we have come to crave a favour of you, O our father." "It is your privilege at this celebration to receive any favour your hearts may wish," he replied graciously, placing his fingers beneath their girlish chins. "The favour is yours before you ask it, my daughters." "Will you, for our sakes, invite the great northern hostile tribe, the tribe you war upon, to this our feast?" they asked fearlessly. "To a peaceful feast? A feast in honour of women?" he exclaimed incredulously. "So we would desire it," they answered. "And so it shall be," he declared. "I can deny you nothing this day, and some time you may bear sons to bless this peace you have asked, and to bless their mother's sire for granting it." Then he turned to all the young men of the tribe and commanded, "Build fires at sunset on all the coast headlands, fires of welcome. Man your canoes and face the north. Greet the enemy, and tell them that I, the Tyee of the Capellanos, ask, no, command, that they join me for a great feast in honour of my 2 daughters." And when the northern tribes got this invitation, they flocked down the coast to this feast of a great peace. They brought their women and their children. They brought game and fish, gold and white stone beads, baskets and carven ladles, and wonderful woven blankets to lay at the feet of their now acknowledged ruler, the great Tyee. And he in turn gave such a potlatch that nothing but tradition can vie with it. There were long glad days of joyousness, long pleasurable nights of dancing and campfires, and vast quantities of food. The war canoes were emptied of their deadly weapons, and filled with the daily catch of salmon. The hostile war songs ceased, and in their place were heard the soft shuffle of dancing feet, the singing voices of women, the play games of the children of 2 powerful tribes which had been until now ancient enemies. For a great and lasting brotherhood was sealed between them. Their war songs were ended forever. Then the Sagalee Tyee smiled upon his Indian children. "I will make these young-eyed maidens immortal," he said. In the cup of his hands he lifted the chief's 2 daughters and set them forever in a high place, for they had borne 2 offspring, peace and brotherhood, each of which is now a great Tyee ruling this land. And on the mountain crest the chief's daughters can be seen wrapped in the suns, the snows, the stars of all seasons, for they have stood in this high place for thousands of years, and will stand for thousands of years to come, guarding the peace of the Pacific coast and the quiet of the Capilano Canyon. This is the Indian legend of the Lions of Vancouver, as I had it from one who will tell me no more the traditions of his people. End of The 2 Sisters by Pauline Johnson.
Upon Westminster Bridge by William Wordsworth. Read for LibriVox.org by David Barnes. Earth has not anything to show more fair. Dull would he be of soul who could pass by a sight so touching in its majesty. This city, now doth like a garment wear the beauty of the morning, silent, bare. Ships, towers, domes, theatres, and temples lie open unto the fields and to the sky, all bright and glittering in the smokeless air. Never did sun more beautifully steep in his first splendour valley, rock, or hill. Ne'er saw I, never felt, a calm so deep. The river glideth at his own sweet will. Dear God, the very houses seem asleep, and all that mighty heart is lying still. End of poem. This recording is in the public domain.